Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was entrusted with a legendary gift. When Naruto is given a gift considered legendary even in a world where walking on water is a daily occurrence for some, will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of said gift leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 78, Embers 2. Naruto took in a long, deep breath as he gently ran his hands through Fu's verdant hair, playing with the individual strands as the girl slept, huddled against his form. They were both sweaty and the cool morning air had the hair across his body standing on end, but he still couldn't do anything but smile as the snoozing girl murmured something unintelligible into the pillow, blissfully asleep. As much as he didn't want to move from this unbelievably comfortable position, the late morning sunlight was already streaming in through the windows, and they had kept Tsunami waiting for long enough. Fu. He gently shook the girl's shoulder, immediately making her curl further into the warm embrace of the covers in a vain attempt to stave off reality. In the end though, as it always did, consciousness prevailed, and a bleary-eyed, but still lightly smiling Jinchuriki slowly rose up, her upper body still bare. Naruto gained a light blush looking down on her body, still covered in just a thin sheen of sweat from their previous activities. It certainly brought back a lot of recent memories, very good memories. Must we get up now? The blonde raised an eyebrow. It was very unlike Fu to act petulant, even if it was only half seriously said. Then again, last night Naruto had discovered an entirely new side to Fu he had never imagined before. The very light and already fading nail marks on his back were certainly testament to that. Yeah, come on, I can smell breakfast downstairs. It was like an instant change in the girl. She practically shot out of the bed, still as naked as the day she was born. The blonde simply chuckled to himself as he watched her quickly dash about the room, gathering up clothes that had been haphazardly strewn across the room randomly. Most amusing were the fishnet shorts the two had somehow managed to lodge atop the curtain bracket. Even Naruto didn't remember how that happened. After a moment or two though his stomach grumbled noisily, and he too got up, joining Fu in her search for their elusive clothing. The two left Nami no Kuni in considerably higher spirits than when they entered, greeting people in the streets congenially and sparing a few moments to those that recognized them. Naruto was surprised and inwardly pleased and a little excited by the impact the pair had managed to make on the little nation. Many people remembered how they had helped them when the country was impoverished without asking anything in return. By the time they actually managed to reach the great bridge connecting Nami with the mainland, it was already past noon, although that didn't stop them marveling at the amazing construct. Kibu Bridge. Appropriate. Naruto had to nod at whoever decided to name the bridge that. It really was a beacon of hope, telling the downtrodden that there was always a way out and to never give up. However, there was only so long the two could spend staring at a bridge, and soon they were on their way again. However, Naruto was happily surprised when Fu hesitantly linked arms with him as they walked, enjoying her body pressed up against his side as they moved through the forest. So why don't we simply fly to Aim no Kuni? They had been walking along in pleasant silence for a while, sometimes idly chatting about some of the things they had seen in Nami no Kuni. Naruto simply smirked at the question though, wondering if Fu would ask. It was almost as if he could no longer quite predict what the girl would say. It was almost as if she had changed overnight, losing some of that shy, introverted edge she had. Really, after all this time you're tired of walking? Naruto couldn't help but jest back at her. After all, she had gone silent and without complaint all these years now. Fu just gave him an even stare in return, making him chuckle half amused and half sheepishly. The girl could manage intimidating rather easily. I would think getting to Amagakure would be rather important considering what we found out. Naruto shrugged slowly. He had obviously considered the idea himself before dismissing it. The Akatsuki isn't going anywhere. In fact, if we wait long enough, they would quite happily come to us. But in any case, flying would be a bad idea. We would have to cut right over High no Kuni, putting us at risk of attracting Konoha's attention. As indifferent as I profess to be to my former home, Fu raised a single eyebrow at that. I really don't want to involve them any more than I want to confront possible family. Fu's eyes narrowed briefly, searching Naruto's face for any hint that he was hiding something, but looked away satisfied. We could fly around the bordering nations. Naruto shrugged again, more nonchalantly this time as he picked the pace up slightly, responding to Fu's subtle encouragements that she thought they should be traveling faster. Same problem really, especially as one of those nations we would have to fly over contains Takigakure. Fu looked down at that, just the smallest of frowns briefly passing over her features. It didn't go unnoticed by the blonde, and he had to suppress a slight sigh. It didn't stop him from gently placing his arm around his lover's shoulders in comfort. Just as Konoha still held less than pleasant memories for him, the scars the caramel-skinned girl had received, emotionally at least, had never truly healed, they had only been moved out of sight. Trying to move the conversation onto something other than her painful past, Fu looked up, her face molding into a picture of thought. How about summoning us there? Naruto paused in the middle of the path, looking around at Fu slightly incredulously. I would need to actually be there all ready to summon you. Fu nodded, walking on as Naruto moved to join her again, still staring at her strangely. It really was odd to see her so talkative, especially about such an apparently inane topic. What about a clone? Naruto almost paused again, but Fu just carried on walking, so he stopped himself before he could. You know, in all this time I have never once tried to summon myself with a clone. In fact, Naruto couldn't remember an instance where one of his clones had ever actually summoned anything. This time it was Fu who paused to look at Naruto oddly. She sometimes wondered if the teen had more power than he really knew what to do with. She had just gotten a very succinct answer. Really? What do you do all day? Naruto actually chuckled at that, looking around just in time to see Fu's slight smirk slip off her face as she masked it behind her usual placid expression, although it seemed a little strained. Well, let's see, most recently I got up, meditated, went through my chakra control exercises. You and I had he received an impromptu light-hearted punch to the arm from a suddenly blushing mint-haired Jinchuriki as the verdette managed to impressively look everywhere except at her blonde traveling companion. He chuckled again at her expression, wondering just where this side of Fu had been all these years he had known her. It was like meeting a completely new person. Maybe that next step in their physical intimacy had been just what she needed to finally crack that shell around her she had built all those lonely years in Taki. It wasn't just him either. Coming through Nami he had noticed that when people would recognize them, Fu would be far more animate in their conversations than she normally might. She would actually talk to them, even smiling when one or two of the younger children would call her Wani-chan. It was definitely a change Naruto could support. He enjoyed seeing the girl he loved finally breaking down those final few barriers and reintegrating herself into somewhat normalcy. You know I was joking. Naruto was snapped out of his pleasant thoughts as Fu's mumbled words reached his ears, the girl still managing to find the ground impossibly interesting. Yes, I know, but you are much cuter when you blush. He nearly broke out laughing again as he spotted the shade of red that had violently invaded the bridge of her nose start to spread to the edges of her cheeks. He supposed there was still one aspect about Fu he could rely on. The teen Jinchuriki certainly didn't know how to take a compliment. Anyway, I still think the clone is a good idea. Naruto raised an eyebrow before remembering the conversation they were just having. At this point Fu had just about managed to compose herself, the blush nothing more than a light dusting of pink on her cheeks, barely noticeable with her complexion. Oh? How so? I would still have to get the clone there, even if it could summon us. Honestly, the idea of summoning himself sounded ill-advised. If something were to go wrong, then there would be no way for him to fix it, as it would be him it affected. However, he decided to humor the girl for a while. After all, there was little else to talk about on the long forest path that stretched off seemingly endlessly into the shade of the trees. You could henge the clone into some kind of bird, let it fly ahead, and then allow it to summon us once it reached a sufficient distance. Naruto nodded for a moment in thought. However, Fu immediately noticed it was put on for show. She frowned cutely, crossing her arms under her chest and unconsciously highlighting her assets. You don't have to mock the idea. Naruto quickly shook his head, an amused smile fighting against his fabricated mask of seriousness. No, it's a good idea. In fact, I can only find one flaw in it. Fu blinked, unsure of whether Naruto was actually being serious or not as she leaned in a little closer unconsciously. Naruto's voice naturally had a way of drawing one in, joking or not, and she found herself immediately curious. What? Naruto just looked up at a random tree, hand on his chin as he struck an obviously over-exaggerated thinking pose, pausing for a few moments just for the suspense. I have no idea how to perform a henge. Fu almost face-faulted into the ground, only her natural unflappability and general poise stopping her. It didn't stop the smile from spreading over the blonde's face as he watched her incredulous reaction. How can you not know a basic technique like that? In hindsight, Fu couldn't remember an instance of Naruto ever actually using the fundamental shinobi techniques, but she had least assumed that at his power, he would know something so utterly basic to even an academy student. Naruto simply gave a non-committal shrug as they continued on down the winding path. The sun was making its steady descent down the sky, so the many shadows of the trees had begun to stretch out eastward. I'm not a shinobi, remember. I don't know the basic clone or the substitution techniques either. Fu blinked at that, trying to think of an instance of her friend using either jutsu. I only know the very fundamentals of the henge from when I was trying to create an invisibility technique, not the actual technique itself. Fu nodded at that, remembering her amusement and intrigue as Naruto created what he dubbed the moving henge. So does that mean dash? Fu stopped mid-sentence as she noticed Naruto had stopped, a frown flashing across his brow as he looked of somewhere to the west of them. The mint-haired teen followed his gaze up to what looked like an old fortress up on a hill, only its silhouette was really visible backed by the sun. What is it? She turned back to her friend, but already saw him carrying on down the path, that same frown still marring his features. Two shinobi are fighting in an old fortress up there, powerful ones. It was strange, their signatures that he could sense through the water vapor in the air were familiar and at the same time, similar to one another. However, he couldn't quite remember where or when he had felt this chakra before. It wasn't like with his practically eidetic memory, chakra signatures were more something he felt and were more difficult to discern from one another. He felt as though it was right on the tip of his tongue just as he felt another presence enter his senses, this one instantly familiar due to the sheer magnitude of it. Ah, Samahata was right then, it is you. Practically all of Naruto's muscles tensed as Kisame's harsh tone sounded through the forested area, quickly followed by the very same man walking out of the tree line. He wore the usual Akatsuki robe along with an all-too cocky grin as he lugged the massive wrapped sword atop his shoulder. You know, Samahata has been bugging me for a long while now to come and find you, little monk. It just can't get enough of your delicious chakra. I don't know what it is, Samahata just says you taste like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Naruto almost quirked an eyebrow at the large wrapped sword that was practically vibrating in anticipation atop the former Kirinin's shoulder. What does the Akatsuki want now? I thought you couldn't come after me until the other Biju were sealed? Kisame raised his brow at that, his smirk widening to show a row of sharp and suitably shark-like teeth. Well, aren't we a well-informed little monk? Naruto simply remained impassive. He had learned a lot more than about the Akatsuki's leader from Kakuzu. Kisame's grin never slipped even as a tense silence fell over the group, each knowing that the first to move would be the one to instigate the fight. In any case, I'm not here for the Akatsuki. He looked up in mock thought, a hand coming up to his chin in a casual gesture that seemed out of place in the tense situation, although I suppose this will further the goal. Naruto began slowly building up his chakra, feeling for the nature energy surrounding them and drawing it in as slowly and subtly as possible. Fu had told him what she knew of the two Akatsuki members they had yet to actually face in a fight, and her information on the former Kirigakure shinobi was surprisingly in-depth. Apparently Kisame hadn't exactly been subtle in his skills while he was still working as a hunter nin. His massive chakra reserves were well known, thus his nickname of the tailless-tailed beast. There was also his sword, Samahata, a sentient weapon with the ability to absorb chakra as it shaved into the enemy. Of course, as a member of the Akatsuki, he would have only gotten stronger in his time as a nuke nin, at least on par with the others they had faced and probably stronger. No, this is for Samehada, not Akatsuki. I like to treat my blade every once in a while. Now hold still so Samehada can have a little taste. Anything else the massive blue-skinned man might have said was lost as Fu suddenly shot forward, a crisp orange cloak of chakra appearing around her body faster than a civilian could blink. Two vicious swords of water appeared in her hands, stained violet by the cloak of chakra, as her rapidly beating pair of wings took her on a low skimming path across the ground. However, Kisame simply remained in place, actually swinging his still bandaged sword off his shoulder just to rest it on the ground casually. What, you thought I would come alone? Fu didn't make it halfway across the distance between them before the ground in front of her was blown outward in a conflagration of flame and broken earth. She diverted her course in time, pulling up so harshly she felt the sudden shift in direction pull at her bones uncomfortably. Haha, I finally get to prove to you my art, yeah. Naruto sucked in air through his teeth as he looked up, spotting the form of the blonde Akatsuki he thought Fu had dealt with back in Mizu no Kuni. He rode on a large white dragon, probably made of clay given what Fu had told him about the crazy artist. He hadn't sensed him because he was too high up, well out of his passive range. He worried that meant the Akatsuki knew about his water sense, or at least were preparing against the possibility. Your fights with me Nanabai. Before Fu could decide what to do, an entire flock of small clay figures, no larger than hummingbirds in shape to match, swarmed from the surrounding trees and shot right at her like deadly little bullets. Naruto watched with slightly narrowed eyes as the mint-haired Jinchuriki was chased into the tree line, disappearing into the shade as she weaved around trees in an attempt to shake her small but maneuverable pursuers. Deidara laughed with an insane glee as his own mount dived down to chase after them and witnessed the result of his art. Naruto and the blue-skinned swordsman were left alone again, a harsh quiet settling back down even as dulled, muffled explosions echoed through the forest. Ooh, so cold leaving your little girlfriend alone with the mean old artist. From what I was told about you, I had expected you to go running off at the first sign your friend was in trouble. Kisame's smirk took on a more vicious edge as he hefted his sword back up into a more offensive stance. He was naturally the type to play about with his opponents, but this young teen had taken down Sasori and Kakuzu. He was not one to be underestimated. Fu can handle herself, I trust her. Despite Naruto's confident, even tone, he couldn't quell the small spark of worry he felt in his chest for the teen. True, she had dealt with Deidara before, but at the time they had thought he was soundly defeated. The other blonde now had only time to prepare to face Fu again, and he didn't want to know what that twisted artist had come up with for his friend. How did you know we would be here? Kisame grinned, ignoring the agitated vibrations from his sword as it practically begged him to start fighting already. That's the best thing, isn't it? I had no idea you would be here. Me and Deidara were just supposed to keep people away from the two up there. Us meeting up is just a coincidence. He causally motioned to the massive fortress built into the hill where Naruto could still feel those same two shinobi fighting with a large, careless swing of his sword. Samehada can feel your chakra from miles away though, no matter how hard you suppress it, the smell is just too exquisite for it. Naruto spared a glance to the sword which was still quivering just from being in proximity to him. He supposed it must be all the Biju inside of him. However, it seemed Kisame had grown tired of simply talking, as the massive blade was finally raised into an offensive stance. I suppose there is no peaceful way to settle this. Naruto supposed he had to try at least, even if the cruel glint in Kisame's beady eyes told him everything he needed to know. Of course, there is. Naruto raised an eyebrow, but didn't allow the tension to leave his body. He had nearly gathered enough chakra to enter sage mode. You come with us quietly and allow us to rip the Biju out of you and your little girlfriend. The shark-like man grinned even wider as he took a step forward, hefting his weapon to point at the young monk. I'll even spare you one of your arms or legs, how's that sound? Naruto simply released a single breath and a long sigh as he closed his eyes, mildly disappointed. sorry, no deal. When his eyes slowly opened again, they burned the color of molten gold, the air around him shimmering with repressed chakra. One of Fu's shimmering wings of chakra carelessly shaved through the trunk of an old tree as she ducked and weaved in tight arcs as she once again found herself trying to outrun the annoyingly persistent creations of the former Iwagakure shinobi. She could feel him, flying up above her and occasionally throwing taunts down at her, mixed in with new swarms of his lethal sculptures. The tree behind her crashed to the ground, taking out a few of the little white hummingbirds that in turn exploded and carved great swathes from their numbers. In that brief moment or respite, a single arm of bright glowing chakra shot from her cloak, grabbing onto a nearby sturdy bough, and allowing her to swing up in a much tighter maneuver than the clay birds could match. Deidara's eyes widened when he suddenly found Fu careening up towards him, moving so fast that the air at the edge of her flickering wings created small white trails. He tried to force his mount to turn out of her flight path, but it was too late, and not a moment later a spinning blur of orange drilled straight through the much larger dragon. Before the bomber could even detonate the clay, the corrosive properties of the Biju shroud infected the pure white substance, wresting control away from him, and allowing the dragon to fall harmlessly to the ground, already dissolving without the magnificent explosion he had been waiting for. Don't deny me my art, yeah. Fu came to a hovering stop some distance above him, having had to slow down her spin without completely throwing herself off and losing control of her wings. It was always harder to use her drilling spin going up, but she managed, coming out of it in an elegant arc, looking down at Deidara with that same emotionless, disinterested expression that seemed to irritate him so much last time. Sure enough, a scowl broke out over his features as he thrust his hands back into the pouches on his waist. Fu noted that he had brought a lot more than he had last time. Don't underestimate me, He slapped his hands together, and when he brought them apart, 3 small clay dragons were wrapped around his wrists. They didn't stay that size for long though, and soon Fu was staring down at 3 large white dragons, each the size of the blonde's previous mount. You're nothing more than a test. A stepping stone for my art to reach the next level and finally be enough for him. He spat the last word in contempt as he shot a scathing look towards the fortress that lay silently below them in the waning light of the evening. He didn't seem entirely focused on the fight, so Fu decided to remind him that he was in the middle of a fight as she darted down. Deidara looked around to see Fu take a deep breath, her chakra-shrouded chest expanding much more than should have been physically possible before she breathed out an enormous cloud of glittering dust that immediately caught the dimming light streaming over the horizon, reflecting it so many times it was like a small sun hovering in the sky. However, the mint-haired girl wasn't prepared for Deidara to suddenly burst through the cloud of dust. His long blonde bang moved to cover his usually exposed eye to reveal some kind of device over the other. A grin alighted on his face as he saw his opponent caught unawares, signaling for 2 of the dragons to break off and encircle the girl. You think I wouldn't be prepared for your tricks? Your art is stale and lacks vision. My art is only evolving, growing and becoming better because my art is an explosion. Fu braced her body for the explosion she had been expecting, however there was no flash of light or burn of fire. Instead, she was surprised to feel something soft and sticky wrap around her body, and when he opened her eyes, she saw that the 2 dragons had indeed exploded, but into a softer, almost liquid clay that had proceeded to cover her in a bubbling white paste. His eyes widened at the implications of that even as Deidara's grin widened, his hands moving into an all too familiar hand seal. Katsu. The sky lit up in a plethora of yellows and oranges as a great plume of flame rose into the sky, quickly washed away as a great shockwave of air ripped across the sky, scattering clouds and blowing smoke across the entire area. Deidara strained his eyes to peer through the smoke, looking for the falling, charred body he wanted to see. He had seen how the girl moved the last time they fought, and he knew he had to somehow restrict her movements if he wanted to catch her in his art. Clouds began to gather above him, darkening the sky as the low rumbles of thunder began to make themselves known. Slowly rain began to fall, dispersing the dust enough for Deidara's enhanced eye to pick out a small, curled-up form within the smoke. Slowly Fu unraveled her body, the bubbling, incoherent 6-tailed cloak she had been forced to form slowly receding into her body, until only wings remained to keep her aloft. Her body was littered in light burns and her clothing was charred, but she was otherwise unhurt. Deidara's eyes narrowed in rage as his hand curled into a fist. However, before his scathing, enraged remark could leave his lips, the sky chose that moment to unleash its wrath. The first strike cracked the earth beneath Naruto's feet as he blocked it with a thick black rod of chakra. Kisame's strength was immense, but with nature energy surging through his system, Naruto was actually stronger, and bit by bit he was able to start pushing the larger man back. However, Kisame wasn't a master swordsman for nothing and was easily able to use Naruto's momentum against him, allowing the younger teen to lunge forward as he suddenly changed his grip, spinning around to gouge a pound out of the blonde's back. Samahata met its mark, but only received a few strips of cloth and a cascade of sparks for its efforts as it ground against the monk's tough Azura path before Naruto jumped away. The Rinnegan bearer frowned as he shucked his light, airy Hayori, leaving him in just his loose brown pants and traditional sandals. The chakra rod in his hand crumbled away into dust as the chakra holding it together finally fell apart, too much of it absorbed by the hungry blade. It would appear he would need something more permanent to face such a blade wielded by such a skilled swordsman. His hands were quickly wreathed in blue and red flames before being brought together. Banbutsu Suzu, Tanbajiri, he brought his hands apart, and in between them a long, intricately carved wooden pole began to appear, engraved lovingly with light golden patterns of winding vines that looked so detailed it was as if the plants themselves wreathed the shaft. At the base of the weapon a long plume of fine red threads cascaded down, brushing the floor gently. The top though was tipped by a razor-sharp and curved blade that glinted dangerously in the dimming light trickling through the trees. In under a few seconds Naruto was carefully holding a long, gleaming naginata in his hands that even Kisame had to stop and appreciate for a few moments. Nice blade, bit of a presumptuous name though, don't you think? Naruto simply allowed a small smile to tweak up on the corners of his mouth as he settled back into what looked like a well-practiced stance, his weight towards his back foot. Why don't you find out? Kisame grinned broadly as he once again altered the grip on his blade, opting for a strong one-handed grip, and he rushed forward, the ground under his feet bursting back as he sped forward. His first lunge was dodged as Naruto slipped to the side, using the advanced senses nature energy gave him to preemptively predict the strike. He ducked under the follow-up swipe that passed over his head, so close he could spot the individual scales writhing beneath the clean white bandages wrapping the blade. He tried to sweep Kisame's legs out from under him, but the man simply drove his sword into the ground, blocking the finely crafted naginata from connecting. You're good kid, but stick to stuff you know, blades are my thing. Naruto just smirked as he revealed the hand he had taken off his blade to point at Kisame's chest. Good advice, Shinra-tensei. With his blade planted firmly into the ground, Kisame didn't even have time to widen his eyes before his body was wrenched backwards by a bone-crunching invisible force. Naruto gazed into the small line of destruction the large Akatsuki member had gouged through the forest. After a few tense moments he staged back into the small clearing they had been using as a battleground. His robe was hanging off his body, so he quickly shucked it, leaving him in the same state of dress as Naruto. I didn't think you monks were the eye for an eye type of people. Naruto shrugged nonchalantly as he spans his blade and returned to a ready stance, next to where Samahata was still planted eye on the ground. He would have to keep Kisame as far from that blade as possible to give him enough advantage to finish this quickly and get to Fu. I like that, Hayori. Kisame grinned as he spat out a wad of blood, experimentally twisting his torso to make sure he had full maneuverability. However, before either could make another move, rain began to fall from dark, angry clouds that hadn't been there a few minutes ago. Moments later there was an enormous flash of light as the skies were viciously rent open. Chapter 79, Embers 3. Everyone for a mile around the old Uchiha fortress froze, looking up towards the heavens as a great beast of pure light roared for one long, inexplicable moment. Vaguely, a single-minute figure could be seen hovering in the sky, framed by the light of the magnificent beast of energy, but only for a fleeting moment before it was sent crashing back into the fortress. Naruto and his swordsman opponent had done their best to ignore the great gouts of flame being sent careening into the clouds, even as they had caused a small storm to gather and rain to fall. However, something like this was impossible to ignore. Up in the sky, the bomber and the Nanabi Jinchuriki were likewise transfixed by the incredible sight, at least until some lingering electricity up in the clouds caused Deidara to wince as a stray arc ran the length of his arm. Both were snapped out of their dazes as Fu's reformed wings burst into action, sending the lithe teen right at the former Iwa Nin. The crazed blonde wasn't caught unaware though as he threw his hands out, crafting small but deadly birds of clay with astounding speed, throwing them out one by one on an intercepting course with the incoming drill of a girl. Katsu. The thin, insectoid wings naturally curled around the verdette on some base instinct as the familiar cry sounded out above the harsh pelting of the rain. However, when no intense explosion came, no burning sensation as the air around her was set alight, Fu hesitantly uncurled. Deidara's creations were struggling just to stay airborne, never mind explode. In fact, one or two had already slowed down enough to drop from the sky. The girl floated there in the air, watching the little sculptures carefully as they flew on by her lamely. She even swatted one away with the back of her hand only for it to practically dissolve and fall from the sky. A quick glance over to Deidara told her this was not part of any plan if his angered and frustrated expression was anything to go on. Even the massive dragon he was riding on seemed to struggle to move its mighty white wings, and the only reason it seemed to have not succumbed to its fellow artwork's fate was the hand Deidara had firmly pressed against its head. Fu only realized what was going on when she noticed that the fine hairs on the back of her arms had risen slightly due to the intense lingering electricity in the atmosphere. Earth chakra. She nodded to herself. Deidara's sculptures must have relied on some form of perverse earth-natured chakra, so naturally lightning would be its weakness. The tiniest flicker of a smirk crossed the Nanabi Jinchuriki's features as she floated there in the sky before flashing through a set of rapid hand seals. Suitun, Mizukiri. Water from the atmosphere, of which there was plenty thanks to the lingering storm clouds, gently condensed around her clenched fist until a long thin katana made of pure water rested in her grip. It was her own personal refinement of her former village's famous water-cutting sword, sacrificing substance for a keener edge. It would last long against any normal sword, or even most strong jutsu, however, for her purpose it was perfect. Don't get cocky, Jinchuriki, a sword isn't going to help you here. Not when you can't even get close to me, yeah? Fu didn't say anything, focusing on the blade in her hand, and the way her chakra ran through it, converted to water nature as it left the tenketsu in her palm. Slowly she altered the chakra, rubbing it and exciting it until a small, chirping-like noise filled the space around her, and the water sword began to glow with a brilliant inner light. Her hand began to vibrate uncontrollably, and a wince passed over her features, so she quickly pulled up a one-handed ram seal before slowly and meticulously passing through the one-handed seal's haku had taught her. It had taken the pair a long time to figure out just how to use this particular ninjutsu, drawing on Haku's experience combining chakra natures and Fu's natural abilities to weather the failures. It was always dangerous to work with lighting chakra, especially when you weren't quite sure what it was you were trying to do. However, with Fu's natural healing she could plow through the pain of a few shocks. Though that didn't stop the irritation she felt when the blade still caused her hand to go numb, but with the burns littering her arms that may have been a mixed blessing. Raitun, Arashikiri. The crackling in the air stopped, replaced by a low, irritating hum that had the hairs on the back of Deidara's neck rise. However, he tried to put that off as he finally felt his chakra return to normal, no longer affected by the lingering electricity in the air. Ha! Too late, girlie. Time to appreciate my art, yeah. The clay dragon he was riding seemed to regain its normal movement as its wing beats grew stronger, lifting the mad bomber higher into the sky. Fu ignored him though, focusing on the blade in her hand as the quiet hum grew louder, matching the rain pouring against both their skin. Deidara's eye twitched dangerously as he stamped his foot on the dragon once, the large, bulbous tail that seemed to be made from many increasingly smaller balls of clay shortened by a single ball. A moment later and a smaller, chibi version of the dragon was spat from his mount's mouth, unfurling and shooting down at Fu in one smooth motion. Katsuga! Deidara tried to cry out his signature line, but was drowned out as three things happened near simultaneously. Fu's eyes snapped up to the incoming missile, a crisp orange cloak of burning chakra surrounded her form, and she brought the hand holding her blade around in one smooth arc. The red-stained blade of water and lightning snapped out, elongating to almost ridiculous proportions as it sliced straight through the little clay dragon, causing it to harmlessly split in two neat halves before falling to the earth, rendered inert by the lightning chakra. However, it hadn't stopped there. Deidara felt the word choke in his throat as he gulped once, shakily bringing his head around to look as a thin line of red slowly spread around the circumference of his left arm. Not even a moment later he cried out in agony as a massive spurt of blood sprayed through the air. The white dragon he rode slowly split apart, the two halves falling to meet its smaller counterpart and allowing Deidara to drop down with them. The former Iwanin barely seemed to notice the fact he was falling. His eyes were transfixed by his left arm, or more specifically the stump that had once been his arm. The arm itself was falling beside him, just out of reach and steaming from where it had been cleanly sliced through. The blonde bomber was lucky the supercharged attack had cauterized the wound even as it was slicing through, or he probably would have already gone into severe shock from the blood loss. As it was, he was able to shakily grit his teeth, contorting his body in midair, so his one workable arm could reach around into the pouch by his side. However, even as he was turning, he could only cry out again, as bright bolts of searing pain lanced up his right arm. Fu had met his dive, screaming down towards him and stabbing what remained of her jutsu, now a mere flickering dagger of water, right into his exposed hand, the tip of the blade, stained red for an entirely different reason now, emerging from Deidara's one remaining mouth hand. "Arg, damn it, you bitch!" Deidara tried to punch the girl off of him, but he could barely make a fist from how numb and stiff his hand had gone. In any case, Fu pushed off of him, only adding to his momentum as he fell and creating distance between them in case he had anything else up his sleeve. The chakra cloak had receded, it was only there to minimize the damage her jutsu would do to herself after all, and maintaining it for too long would only be detrimental, Chome helping her or not. She watched dispassionately as a large dust cloud was raised where Deidara crashed into the ground, her wings quickly beating to bring her down to the ground. She wasn't going to be fooled by a decoy and let him escape this time. "Suitun, Sukodan no Jutsu." Kisame's voice roared above the sound of the pelting rain as the water drops were absorbed into his growing technique, a great shark of glowing blue water that hung over his head before shooting forward, swimming through the air like it was water. However, it harmlessly dispersed as it slammed into a wall of invisible, unpassable force that carried on through the technique, ripping up the ground and nearly throwing Kisame back through the trees again had the large blue man not flickered out of the way in a well-timed shunshin. "Shinra Tensei." Naruto lowered his arm, his burning golden eyes searching throughout the clearing for any sign of his opponent. He had managed to maintain his position near where Samahata was still planting into the ground, but Kisame was making it difficult for him to stay there. The superior swordsman had already managed to disarm him of the Naginata, proving that even without his iconic blade he was a force to be reckoned with. Naruto had also painfully learned that his Preta path was all but useless against Kisame's water jutsu, as even if he absorbed the chakra in them the force of the water was still enough to hurt him. Right now, though, it felt as though Kisame was merely playfully poking at his defense, testing it out in order to find his limits. He never stayed in one spot long enough for Naruto to try and grab him with a Banzhou Tenin. It was coming to almost the point where Naruto felt like leveling the clearing around them in order to smoke him out. However, his eyes flashed with victory as he felt Kisame pause in the trees through his water sense, his chakra building up for a jutsu. Instantly Naruto's hands found themselves instinctually grabbing the ram seal as his head flicked around to his target. "Geto, Kusari." There was a momentary sound of struggle along with Kisame's grunts and muttered curses, but after a few seconds the large shark-like man was brought into the clearing, bound almost head to toe in deep obsidian chains tipped with vicious hooks. Naruto didn't particularly enjoy the rather cruel appearance of his outer path's chains, but they were certainly useful. Hee, so this is the power of the Rinnegan. It's so frightening. Despite his situation, Kisame still had that same self-satisfied smirk on his face, although he couldn't hold back the occasional wince as he felt his chakra being slowly siphoned away through the black chains. What did the Akatsuki want with the Biju? Despite the information Kakazu had given, that was the one thing the ancient Takinin couldn't answer. Kisame just chuckled though, glancing about at his restraints as though Naruto wasn't even there. This is pretty interesting, never seen Leader Sama use this one before. It almost reminds me of that annoying, loudmouth redhead I fought all those years ago. The vicious grin returned as he glanced back towards the blonde again. Didn't help her back then either. Sutaion, Dai Bakusui Shoha. Naruto barely had time to whiten his eyes as Kisame's chest suddenly puffed out before the swordsman spewed out an absurd amount of water. Enough that he should have died from dehydration more than 100 times over from it. The crushing pressure of the gout was enough to break Naruto's concentration, as he was swept away from the blue-skinned man and his now freed sword. However, moments later he felt the flow of the water change, now drawing him back towards the epicenter. He didn't hear the name of the jutsu being called out, but he could see its effects as an enormous dome of water was formed atop the forest, bending trees with its enormous weight. Naruto had to marvel at the magnitude of the jutsu. For such a thing to be possible when Kisame wasn't even a Jinchuriki was astounding. The dome of water even eclipsed the hill and fortress nearby, now blurred and unrecognizable from within. Naruto floated there for a moment, calming himself down so his body wouldn't use more oxygen than it needed to. However, his eyes widened as he felt a presence approaching rapidly. Only a burst of wind chakra from the Tenketsu across his right side managed to move him out of the way in time for a speeding creature to go shooting past, inches from carving into him with sharp claws and glinting teeth. It had only been for a moment, but Naruto's Rinnegan had managed to capture every inch of Kisame's frightening transformation. He couldn't be sure, but the blonde suspected Kisame had somehow fused with Samehada, as the blade was nowhere to be seen. The shark-like traits of the man had been exaggerated tenfold, a large fin sprouting from his back as his body grew and morphed to accommodate its new aquatic needs. Even as he was figuring this out, the swordsman was coming around for another pass. This time Naruto was sure he wouldn't be fooled by a burst of chakra to move him out the way. Instead, he brought his hands up into an old classic, a seal he hadn't used in a while. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. The words were muffled by the water, but the effect was unchanged as 5 copies of the monk popped into existence, his refined chakra control making it so there wasn't even a burst of smoke to herald their arrival. Instantly each clone began swimming off in a different direction, using bursts of well-timed chakra to power their way through the water as quickly as possible to escape the dome. Kisame spun to a stop where they had been, looking at each of the fleeing clones in turn before a cruel smirk grew on his flattened features. Using the shark's tail that came with his transformation, Kisame suddenly powered straight down in a seemingly random direction away from any of the fleeing clones. However, it was quickly revealed there was method in the seeming madness as his clawed and webbed hands shot forward, raking through seemingly empty water. However, his grin only grew as 4 lines of blood rewarded his efforts as a 6th Naruto shimmered back into the visible spectrum, wincing from the new wound across his chest. Silly monk, I can sense everything in this dome, visible or not. Oddly, the man's voice seemed unimpaired by the water and carried to the blonde easily, his cruel, playful tone not lost on his ears as he clutched at his chest. Kisame quirked a brow when Naruto said something, however it only came out as bubbles, so whatever was said was lost on the shark-like being. However, the laugh at the end wasn't missed in the slightest, and before Kisame could spin around to lash out with his tail, the Naruto in front of him disappeared in a burst of smoke. His beady black eyes widened in surprise. That hadn't been a clone, he was absolutely certain of it. Samehada could detect things like that easily. Outside the water dome, one of the clones Kisame had deemed unimportant enough not to chase down watched curiously as the ceiling matrix faded away, leaving a blinking, but at least in one piece Naruto standing there, looking over his body frantically. Once he was sure everything had come across in the summoning, he grinned with a small unnoticeable sigh of relief. Good thing that worked, boss? Naruto looked up, remembering his clone was still there and remembering how the copies usually liked to address him. It really had been a while since he used them in any significant way, and now the technique might have just saved his life. Yeah, I'll have to thank Fu for the idea later, even if it was unwholesomely reckless. Who knew what could have gone wrong with Naruto trying to summon himself? The sheer statement made one want to scratch their head in confusion. At least it was good to know it worked for the future. Maybe it's better she doesn't find out. Both blondes paused for a moment before giving a simultaneous nod. At the same moment small shivers ran down their spines. They didn't think that the fact it was her idea would dissuade Fu from the fact Naruto had done something that he himself had called needlessly reckless. Both monks were snapped out of their momentary pause by the joint memory of a not-so-lucky clone being viciously ripped into by the still amphibious Kisame, no doubt looking for the real one amongst the stragglers. Naruto's features hardened as he looked back towards the dome, the clone disappearing into smoke behind him as he began to run towards it. However, instead of diving in, he began running up the surface, showing a remarkable combination of surface clinging and water walking simultaneously. His sprint was short-lived as he was suddenly forced to dive out of the way of a leaping pair of watery jaws. He managed to stay on the surface of the water, but without his forward momentum, and thanks to the odd angle of the dome it proved difficult to stay that way. He got to his feet and started running again, using bursts of wind chakra to propel himself up, dodging more and more watery sharks as they appeared from the dome seemingly without warning. Luckily in Sage Mode Naruto's senses were heightened to the maximum, almost like a form of brief precognition, at least as far as hostile intent went, and he was able to reach the top of the dome. Looking down into the clear waters, he managed to catch a glimpse of Kisame just finishing off the last of the clones within the dome. The blue-skinned creature that the swordsman had become barely managed to look up to where the original was stood before the blonde monk slammed his hands down onto the surface of the water. Shinra Tensei. Now, Naruto could have expected many things to happen as he sent that enormous wave of pure gravitational force through the dome of water, such as a large shockwave, or for the force being spread out too much amongst the medium for there to be much of an effect beyond being a deterrent. However, he had certainly not been expecting the entire dome to suddenly quiver dangerously, nor for Kisame to suddenly writhe inside his own jutsu, blood coming from his mouth and ears in great inky sprays that spread out around him, turning the water pink. The intense gravitational wave had not caused a shockwave like Naruto had expected. Instead, it had simply ramped up the already large pressure inside the dome by increasing the weight of every single molecule of water by a factor of almost 10. Kisame's body couldn't handle the sudden water pressure, akin to being at the bottom of the ocean, and despite his body's changes to accommodate aquatic life, no amount of induced transformation could have prepared him for forces that could rend steel like it was paper. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise when the jutsu beneath him was released, the water pouring out in a great tidal wave in every direction. He struggled to maintain his balance as the water level dropped all the way to the ground, but just about managed it, landing softly on now very wet earth. The destruction the released jutsu had caused was truly remarkable. Trees in every direction for over a mile were rent back, bent like reeds on a riverbank. Now Naruto had to somehow locate his opponents in all this mess. He sighed before stretching out his senses. At least there was plenty of water to spread his chakra through now. Fu's wings fluttered once before allowing her to drop to the dusty ground with barely a whisper, quickly folding into her back before fading away as the chakra once again became insubstantial. Slowly and carefully, without taking her eyes off his body for a moment, the girl walked towards Deidara's unmoving form. Only the occasional twitch as his body convulsed gave away the fact he was still alive. Whether it was from the electricity from her jutsu or the pain of losing an arm, she didn't know. A light groan escaped his lips as she finally stood over him, wondering what to do with him. The decision had been taken from her last time by the bomber's impromptu self-detonation, which had obviously been a decoy. However, now he was really here, in the flesh. It would be easy to kill him, to create a water sword and separate his head from his shoulders. He would never be able to hurt anybody ever again. More importantly, he would never be able to come after the two of them ever again, and the Akatsuki would once again be down a member. However, a small voice in the back of her mind stayed her hand and made her pause to think what Naruto might do. She wasn't entirely sure herself. The blonde's was a difficult mindset to assume. He always seemed to find a way of resolving things without killing, for better or for worse. She looked down at Deidara. He was broken, crippled, and at her mercy. If she walked away, it would only give him a shot at her back. Missing arms could be reattached, wounds healed, but hatred festered and only grew with time. To leave Deidara alive would simply be leaving one more enemy for them to face in the future, and he would only learn from his mistakes and grow stronger. However, once again her hand was stayed as it clenched into a fist. She was no longer Takigaku's weapon. The honed and trained killer they had turned her into. She didn't want that life anymore. There was already so much blood on her hands. Her gaze hardened again. She had killed people far more innocent than this man, under the orders of people far worse. What was one more stain on her soul? Naruto would never kill this man, but maybe that was why she was here, to do the things that he couldn't. To protect him where he would only make himself vulnerable. She could do that for him. She could be Naruto's weapon because she could choose to be. She could do the things he wouldn't let himself do yet still have to be done nonetheless. Problems didn't solve themselves just because you wanted them to. After all, you had to put in some effort on your part even if it wasn't something you would enjoy doing. In her indecision though, she left herself open to attack, and it seemed the blonde Iwanin was coherent enough to realize this as he suddenly grabbed her leg with his remaining arm. He pulled, throwing the Jinchuriki off balance before launching himself at her, scratching and clawing at her until he was on top of the girl. He wore a manic, crazed grin as blood dribbled from the corner of his mouth, using his good arm to tear off the tattered remains of his Akatsuki cloak. Fu couldn't help the grimace as she saw the bomber had another large mouth, this time right over his heart. This is it, Nanabai Jinchuriki, this is my final art. This is what will shake the world and forever emblazon my name in the minds of this land as the greatest artist. Slowly his skin began to become translucent, highlighting what Fu at first thought were veins, but quickly realized were chakra pathways. They had become black and thick enough to be visible, something that certainly wasn't healthy. You can run, but you can't run far enough. His body slowly faded away, just leaving the black lines of his chakra pathway in the shape of his form. Because art. Fu began running, her legs not moving fast enough for her as the black lines began to converge around the bomber's former heart, compacting and condensing. Wings sprung from her back to propel herself forward, but it wasn't enough, she still just couldn't get away fast enough. Is an explosion. There was a moment of utter serenity and silence before Fu knew nothing but white. Naruto had found Kisame within the minute, his limb body laying lamely on the ground, his chest barely rising and falling. Whatever transformation he had been under was reversed and Samahata was lying a few feet away, looking equally damaged with the bindings having come undone to reveal the blue scaly thing that lay hidden beneath. Many of its scales were broken and the sword itself seemed to be whimpering on the ground, trying to slowly edge towards its master. Moments later Naruto had both the sword and the swordsman bound in his chains again, to make sure they wouldn't try anything again. Kisame was in a kneeling position with his head low and his arms pulled out to either side, except this time Naruto had also summoned a good portion of sand to restrain the rest of his body to prevent his repeating the same maneuver. The blonde sat down, letting his injuries get to him as he gently rubbed the gashes across his chest. He would need to see to those soon, but for now. Why are the Akatsuki collecting the Biju? What does your organization gain from all this? Kisame chuckled weakly, still managing to wear that same grin, although it seemed decidedly less cocky when he was bound in this way. Please Gaki, what makes you think I would say anything? Naruto's eyes narrowed slightly as he rocked forward, crossing his legs to get more comfortable. Kakuzu said something similar. Kisame let out a choked laugh at that, some blood escaping the corner of his mouth as he did. Nice try, but if you want to be intimidating to someone like me, gain a few years first, then a few pounds. Naruto kept his face stony as he rocked back again, pondering what to do at this point. You'll eventually tell, I have other ways of finding out after all. Kisame merely grinned, The Akatsuki knew there was no way he was escaping this. He was too low on chakra and Samahata was too damaged to help him there. However, all he needed was a single opportunity, an opportunity that came as the ground suddenly shook violently, a single beam of light stretching high into the sky far from them before a single second of silence. Naruto and Kisame both were transfixed as an enormous explosion, larger than anything the two could have imagined, reached into the sky, possible a mile in radius. Fu. Naruto stared in shock at the titanic blast, his concentration on the chains binding Kisame slipping as he stared in horror. The shark-like man swiped the opportunity, wrenching against his restraints, so that his neck was free and quickly spitting out a ball of water to surround himself. He was still bound in the chains, but the sand had sloughed off him, too heavy to maintain its shape due to the water. His muscles bulged incredibly as he brought a single hand up to prick his thumb on one of his sharpened, shark-like teeth. Naruto turned just in time to see him run through the last hand seal, pressing his palm against the edge of the water prison. Suppose you won't be getting that information now. But that was a good fight, Gaki. Kuchiyos no Jutsu. A burst of smoke filled the small sphere of water, dissipating to reveal Kisame had summoned a small pack of sharks that made quick work of attacking him in his bloodied, defeated state. Naruto tried to pull the man out of there with the chains, but the sharks had bitten clean through them in their attempts to tear away at the swordsman's flesh. The former Kirinin simply closed his eyes and bore it all in perfect, stoic silence. Naruto couldn't tear his eyes away from the horrific sight of his enemy being eaten alive by his own summons until the sphere of water had turned completely red. For another few seconds he simply stared in disbelief, wondering just what could drive a man to do such a thing in the name of an organization like the Akatsuki. He would have to come back and give his enemy a proper burial, if there was anything left of him that was, but for now. Fu. The blonde raced off in the direction of the blast, the massive corona of light still hanging there in the sky. On the way he absently grabbed his shikuju from where he had planted it in the ground earlier. Oddly it didn't even look wet, but Naruto had little time to ponder that as he raced towards his friend and lover, praying that she was okay. Fu's eyes blinked open, calming her breathing when she realized she hadn't felt the searing heat or blinding agony of the blast she had been trying to outrun. In fact, all she had felt in those last few seconds was an odd, distorting feeling that left her with an uncomfortable sensation in her stomach. She saw nothing but cloudy gray skies above her as well as trees that seemed to be bent at rather odd angles. Good, you weren't knocked unconscious. Fu was instantly on alert at the deep, resonating voice, jumping to her feet and darting her eyes about until they landed on a man up in a nearby tree. Her muscles tensed as she saw the signature black cloak with red clouds of the Akatsuki, as well as her orange, swirled mask that hid the man's face from her. Oh, so hostile to the one who saved your life. Fu simply narrowed her eyes, making the man sigh as he leapt from the tree branch to land near her. So predictably dull. I suppose you're wondering why a member of the Akatsuki saved your life? Or perhaps how? He turned his head, looking towards where the bright blast was still raging in the sky, not looking like it was going to burn out anytime soon. It really was a rather remarkable technique. Fu didn't allow her confusion to get to her. It didn't matter how she had been taken miles from the blast in what appeared to be a split second, but why? I'm Tobi, by the way, not that it really matters. In any case, I saved you because having you dead would simply be an inconvenience, something you and that blonde-haired friend of yours just seem to love doing to me nowadays. Fu kept a wary eye on the man, controlling her chakra in preparation for a technique. However, this simply made the man sigh again, this time in mild irritation. Oh, very well, if it will make you feel better. He opened his arms out wide and Fu wasted absolutely no time in darting forward. The ground beneath her feet begins crushed into two small craters by the force of her run. She came to a skidding stop behind the man, her quickly created water sword disappearing as she turned, a frown on her face. She had clearly cut right through the man, but there was no resistance whatsoever, like he wasn't even there. Satisfied yet? Fu's frown deepened as she raced back around, slashing over and over again at the man who wore the Akatsuki's uniform, but to no effect. he simply stood there and allowed all her blows to pass right through his body. Finally, she stopped, taking a few steps back and allowing her water sword to dissipate again. However, she kept her guard up in case it was some kind of ploy. "What do you want?" The mint-haired girl could practically feel the cruel smile the man was giving her behind the mask as he stopped forward, finally casting some light on his mask so that Fu could see what lay behind the single darkened eye hole. "That's simple, I want you to kill the man you love." The blood-red eye hidden in the darkness of the mask spun hypnotically as he spoke, each syllable becoming more and more muffled as Fu felt her vision descending behind a haze, losing herself in that spinning black circle framed by the most brilliant red. Chapter 80, Embers 4. Naruto had to almost physically stop himself as he found himself running blindly through the trees towards the site of the explosion. It raged on ahead of him, like some great ghost of light reaching up towards the sky as if in some ancient prayer. The shockwave had already traveled past him, bending the trees that had been crushed in the previous tidal wave back the other way. Many couldn't take all the differing pressures and had snapped completely, reduced to kindling by the opposing forces. Now the blonde was having to deal with the intense heat washing over the area, however, that was more tolerable, especially when Naruto was completely unconcerned by anything other than Fu's safety, including his own. He came to a stop near a blackened tree stump, taking deep, calming breaths to clear his mind of his distress. Once he had and he could think a lot more clearly, he remembered the various tools in his arsenal to help him with situations like these. Instantly he brought his hand about to summon Fu to him. It would be the fastest way to make sure she was safe. Naruto stopped, gazing oddly at his hand that was trembling just a scant few inches above the surface of the ground. What if Fu wasn't okay and what he was about to summon to him wasn't the girl he loved, but only what was left of her? The young monk's eyes widened at the implications his own mind was giving him, horrific images of burned skin and darkened flesh flashing across his mind. His hand curled inwards shakily as he withdrew it from the ground towards his chest, almost protectively as he stared blankly at the dusty ground. No. He shook his head fiercely, snapping himself out of his own petrification. It was an alien sensation he hadn't felt for a long time, not since Mizu no Kuni. If anything, he was only delaying what help he might be able to give to Fu. She could be badly injured, and he was just standing here deliberating over whether he could face her death. However, once again his hand paused above the ground, quivering with restraint as the words just couldn't make it past his lips. He slowly shook his head, his heart pounding in his ears as he straightened up, reaching out with his senses for any sign of his wayward friend. However, the air was just too dry, the heat from the explosion evaporating any water vapor to beyond useful levels. Charred and lightly burning leaves fluttered past his head, glowing pale hues of orange and yellow as they blackened and broke apart. The blonde stared at his own hand, as if confused by his own inaction. Quivering rippled orbs traced his palm as if it would hold the answer of what to do. However, he didn't find the answer there, but in the faint shine of the Majutama necklace hanging around his neck that glowed in the iridescent light of the various fires littering the forest. Gently he touched a finger to one of the beads, remembering when Fu had given him the gift. His eyes steeled at that. Even if Fu was dead, he needed to know as much. Naruto? This time Naruto's hand paused for an entirely different reason, as the faint voice found its way through the trees towards him. Naruto turned so fast towards that voice it would have made the Raikage raise an eyebrow, just in time to see Fu stumble out of the nearby tree line, seeming a little confused and lost. "Fu, you're okay?" She had a few light burns and scalds across the skin he could see, and she seemed more than a little exhausted by her fight, but none of that mattered, she was alive. I am not sure. Orange eyes widened in surprise, faltering on her words as she was suddenly enveloped in a warm embrace. Naruto had crossed the distance between them faster than she could have believed, wrapping her in a warm, comforting hug that had her unconsciously sighing in relief. It was here when she knew it was over, here in these arms where she felt safe. "It doesn't matter, you're okay, that's all that matters." Fu nodded, a faint smile on her face as she simply enjoyed the contact. Naruto was right, it didn't matter how she was okay, or even how she escaped the blast. However, as that thought came to her, she couldn't help but frown. something nagged at the back of her mind, something inexplicable she couldn't quite grasp. As she opened her eyes, she found herself staring at the kunai she held perfectly balanced between her fingers, having gone unnoticed until now. Why was she holding it like that, pointed right at Naruto's back? Something about that didn't seem right to her, but once again the reason why only drew a blank within her mind. Almost as if in slow motion she watched ponderously as she stabbed the small metal implement right into the blonde's back. The way she had done it would have lodged the blade right into Naruto's heart, a quick turn, and he wouldn't even have realized what had happened before his blood pressure had dropped sufficiently and his body went into shock. It would have been a relatively quick death, Fo had seen it a few times before. However, the last few dregs of nature chakra still within Naruto's system saw to it that his danger instincts kicked in just in time to move his body slightly to the left. Instead of piercing his heart, the clean, sharp blade nearly nicked it, instead puncturing the lung. Before Fo could twist the kunai to correct the slight error, Naruto staggered back, his eyes opened wide in disbelief and pain with the kunai still firmly lodged in his back. He tried to reach around and pull out the blade on instinct, but it was in an awkward position, he couldn't reach. It was probably what saved his life. Fo. He dropped to a knee, teeth clenched in pain as he tried to grab a hold of his erratic chakra system. He had already expunged the remains of the natural energy in his body. After all, if he lost concentration over that, then it would have been far more fatal than a knife to his back. Fo, what's going on? Naruto grunted as he rolled to the side to avoid a fast leg swipe aimed at his chest that would have severely worsened his condition. You moved, that will make this more complicated. Fo stood back up straight, seemingly ignoring the various injuries across her body, as she leveled an even, emotionless look at the blonde. Naruto wanted to cringe away from those eyes, so cold, so lacking in any kind of warmth or compassion it was like the last 3 years might as well never have happened. However, he stood too, a generous distance between the pair as they stared across at one another. Fo had to commend Naruto, even with a rather serious chest wound he was able to stand perfectly straight. It was no doubt thanks to his Azura Path's metal coating stopping the worst of the bleeding. Fo, what is going on? Why are you doing this? The mint-haired girl didn't answer him, merely glancing across his body, picking it apart as she searched for weaknesses to exploit. This was the cold, calculated executioner Naruto had saved from Taki, not the friend and lover he had come to know after all this time. Wings burst from the girl's back, launching her up into the air with rapid, but powerful strokes from the insectoid appendages. Fo wasted no movements as she breathed out a cloud of very recognizable, glittering dust that quickly surrounded the area. At the same moment she brought her hands into the tiger seal. Rinpongdaka dash. Shinra Tensei. Fo never got the chance to ignite the dust as it was pushed back like the great invisible hand of a god had merely swept it aside. She stared down at the blonde at the center of it all, with his clothing torn and his upper half exposed, his hair falling across his eyes to shadow them, and standing amongst the smoldering remains of a forest in the wake of Deidara's last bomb, he looked like some entity of destruction. However, when he lifted his head there was no anger in his eyes, only sadness and betrayal that was quickly masked by a cold steel. I asked what was going on, Fo. The amberized girl again chose not to answer as a liquid, bubbling mass of chakra slowly covered her form. This briefly made Naruto's eyes widen. The chakra cloak lacked any of its usual definition or crispness, meaning Fo was forcefully drawing it against Komiai's will. However, those thoughts took a back seat as 4 wings practically burst from the chakra cloak, as well as a long spindly tail that swayed behind the Jinchuriki menacingly. Naruto tried to gain a grip on the situation, but Fo seemed determined on preventing him any kind of thought as she shot forward, her wings a blur and her body nearly an orange blob as she skimmed across the ground towards him. Shinra Ten Naruto brought his arm up, the words coming from his mouth by instinct only for him to trip over his tongue as instead of the vile orange mass of chakra, he saw Fo, the real Fo, the girl he had woken up with not a single night ago after just having made love. His moment of indecision cost him as Fo flew right by him, a quiet descending over the burning clearing. Arg! Naruto fell to his knees, clutching at his arms as they leaked a steady stream of blood from the two large gashes across his forearms. Even his Azura path hadn't been strong enough to match Fu's Biju enhanced water swords. At least he had managed to bring up a quick defense, or those gashes would have had pride of place alongside the ones Kisame had given him across his chest. However, the pain didn't stop him from bringing his hands up into the ram seal in preparation for Fu's second run. Suddenly the girl found herself strafing to the left and right as great tendrils of sand leapt to Naruto's defense, trying to indiscriminately swat Fu from the sky. Instantly the girl could tell this was Shikaku's work, not Naruto's, which could only mean he was Geto Kusari. Fu was right and realized it just in time to divert her course, screaming up into the air as 5 black chains burst from the ground beneath her, swirling and constricting around thin air. However, they weren't fooled long and soon she was racing across the sky with the surprisingly dexterous chains in pursuit. However, where she would duck between trees, they would rip right through them in their attempts to halt her. What the girl didn't realize in her haste to get away was that they were simply shepherding her in a loop back towards the clearing. Banzhou Tenin. Fu's eyes widened when she realized what was happening, too late as her head spun around to see Naruto's outstretched hands. However, only one aimed at her, the other at a massive ball of sand hovering a distance away in the clearing. The two immediately began flying at one another as their respective gravitation fields towards between each other were amplified greatly. To her credit, Fu didn't even let out a grunt as his body crashed into the sand sphere, quickly being engulfed by the more malleable material, until only her head remained outside, still burning with her Biju's forcefully taken energy. Fu, talk to me, tell me what is going on. Again, Naruto wanted to look away as Fu's cold, emotionless eyes met with his own as her head slowly turned to him. They were completely orange now, lacking any kind of humanity within as the dark energy's influence showed through. I would have thought it obvious. I'm trying to kill you. Her tone, while level and perfectly cold, was still warped and twisted by the chakra shroud, coming out as a growl. Naruto's eyes hardened as he brought the sand sphere closer, chains wrapping around it carefully as an added layer of restraints. Why? Fu's eyes narrowed as she continued to struggle against her bonds. However, while Naruto's body was weakened by his injuries, his control over the sand, aided by Shikaku, was absolute, and it didn't budge an inch. Fu, why are you doing this? What happened? Still not getting an answer, Naruto's frown deepened. He took a step forward, placing his hand on Fu's forehead, wincing as the malevolent chakra burned him. However, the pain was dulled through the Azura path, and he ignored it, instead sending a pulse of his chakra through Fu's system, trying to break the genjutsu she had to be under. She had to be, so he sent another pulse. There was no other explanation, she had to be under a genjutsu, so he sent another pulse. However, as Naruto sent powerful and disruptive pulses of his chakra through the girl's system, the shroud of orange chakra refused to recede. She still glared at him with those cold, unfeeling eyes as his attempts to break the increasingly unlikely genjutsu continued to fail. Finally, he took a step back, a mix of anger and defeat across his features as nothing changed. He brought his hands up into a ram seal, stopping his chakra before pulsing out, even stronger. If Fu wasn't under a genjutsu, then he had to be. However, pulse after pulse, and he was left with exactly the same scenario. Ah, there it is. Naruto froze as the carefree, but pleased tone floated around the clearing, making the blonde look up towards the man carelessly lounging on the branch of a nearby tree, the smoldering bark apparently not concerning him. There's the look I was going for, the defeat, the anguish. He hopped out of the tree, his feet not even bending the grass beneath him as he landed, and not making the slightest noise, like he wasn't really there. You know, I had considered coming before you as Tobi, but I think it would be insulting to you to talk to you as that idiotic persona. So instead, here I am. Naruto's eyes narrowed at the man who shouldn't exist. Literally, Naruto couldn't even feel the slightest thing that could be called a presence from him. Who are you? Naruto found his hand unconsciously bailing into a fist as the man aimlessly wandered towards him. The frustration over this situation, the exhaustion he was feeling from everything that happened, it was all being directed at this Akatsuki robe-wearing man right now. Oh me? Me? I'm nobody. Naruto's ringed eye twitched lightly at that. Something about that statement felt intrinsically wrong to the young blonde. His identity was everything to him. Who he was to his friends, to his loved ones, it was all that mattered, that and who they were to him. For this man to so carelessly throw all that away with such a casual statement, it was like everything Naruto hated in 2 words. Oh yes, there it is again, the anger. I'm not sure if I should feel blasphemous or elated that I can make a monk feel such an emotion. After a moment here it appeared the masked man was actually considering this, his hand against what would have been his chin had the orange, swirled mask not been there. He simply shrugged. Oh well, you were never really that good of a monk anyway. After all. His voice became deeper, far more menacing as Naruto felt his one eye hidden by the darkness of the mask's eye hole, bore right into him. Monks don't kill people, ne. It was just for a moment, a fleeting moment, but as the masked man stressed that final word Naruto was back in Mizu, Shizuka's blood on his hand and Yagura's taunting smile in front of him. You did this, didn't you? He made no motion to fool as his voice became icy cold, but the man seemed to get his point either way, glancing over to the bound girl with an indecipherable expression thanks to the mask. How very astute, or maybe I just made it really obvious. In any case, suppose I did, what would it matter then? His voice had a lilting, mocking tone to it as he rocked back and forth, arms behind his back like some cheeky schoolboy who thought he had done the most hilarious thing in front of the teacher. What did you do to her? The masked man cocked his head to one side like a dog for a moment before glancing at Fu again. Couldn't you tell? It's a genjutsu, of course. I had thought you would have worked that much out yourself. His voice spelled it out like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Naruto didn't realize it, but just the sound of this man's carefree voice was causing his fist to tighten until his knuckles turned white. Why? Why are you doing this? It was a valid question, even if it took all of Naruto's reasoning just to ask as opposed to trying to crush this man against the ground for what he had caused Fu to do. If he had the opportunity to put her under a genjutsu, he could have simply taken her, or killed her. This all just seemed too elaborate. Simple, I wanted this, right here. The masked man gestured around the clearing in a grand sweeping motion that seemed a little too theatrical for the tense situation. I wanted you to despair, to feel this defeat you do now, so you could understand the unfairness of it all, the unfairness of this fake illusion of a world. Naruto had to fight back the snarl as it took every ounce of his self-control to take a shaky, but mildly calming breath. What for? He refused to give the satisfaction of a reaction to this man, or at least he wouldn't have had the man not spoken his next words. For peace, of course. Naruto took a step forward, his violet rippled eyes flashing with anger for a split second. However, when his foot touched the ground again, he was no longer in that smoldering clearing, but in the massive octagonal room of his seal. He blinked in confusion, glancing around at the assembled Biju he had appeared in front of for some kind of an explanation. Some of them seemed worried, like Shikaku and Matatabi, others like Saiken and the Gobi seemed more curious than anything, while the Kyuubi had that same dispassionate, mildly irritated expression it always had. What's going on? Why am I here? He looked around, waiting for one of the mighty beings of chakra to speak, yet whenever one of them looked like they were about to, they sent a furtive glance towards the Kyuubi's cage. Finally, though, Shikaku broke the terse silence, having been fidgeting frantically before. Father was very angry. Naruto's confusion only grew until the Kyuubi's great rumbling voice echoed throughout the room. What the tanuki means is, you were drawing on our chakra. Naruto blinked in genuine surprise at that. He hadn't even felt himself doing it. Then again, the only other time he had really called upon his tenant's chakra, even subconsciously, was against Yagura. The Kyuubi's giant slitted eye followed the blonde carefully before narrowing slightly. Just as you are thinking, you would have likely lost control again had I not pulled you in here. Naruto's frown deepened as he turned towards the fox, a glimmer of hope entering his ripple orbs. Then, you helped me. His trousers, scuffed up and torn as they were, rippled in the warm breeze the Kyuubi's snort of derision caused. Please Ninjin, nothing so mundane. I merely decide who uses my chakra. At that, Naruto's head lowered slightly, his hair falling forward to shadow his eyes. That's it then. In the deafening silence of the seal, the light sound of a single drop of water splashing against cold concrete could be heard like a gong. Naruto looked down at the tear staining the floor before bringing a hand up to catch the one still clinging to his cheek. This is still the way it is, after everything that's happened? His voice was eerily quiet, yet all the Biju could hear it perfectly. Ning dash. My name is Naruto. The blonde's voice echoed as the sheer anger and emotion carried across the room like a physical shockwave. The Kyuubi's eyes widened slightly as with the shout, the cell door of his cage simply crumpled. There was no give, no strain from the metal, it was simply crunched into a ball like it was nothing more than tinfoil in the hands of a disinterested child. The monk himself was now hovering a few feet off the ground, his eyes still shadowed and his hands balled into fists. Why? His voice was no longer a whisper, clearly carrying across the room as if it were being projected by some speaker. Why do you have to make it this way? When his head lifted up, each Biju could see that his eyes were slightly red, and there were a few tear stains across his cheeks. Just this once, why can't you help me? When it's Fu, when it's someone I care about, why can't you just stop with this needless hatred and help me? Slowly as he spoke, his voice became less saddened and instead, angrier, as his frustrations finally got to him. However, after a moment of eye contact between the monk and the great fox, Naruto finally looked away, seeming to deflate as his anger just left him. Why? His drop to the ground, not having even realized he had somehow traversed the distance between them, so he was standing right before the Kyuubi, inside the creature's cell. Somewhere behind them the remains of the cell door, previously having been floating like some piece of astral debris, dropped to the ground with a resounding clang, apparently breaking everyone out of the silence that had enveloped the room. What is this? Naruto looked up, blinking once with deadened, lifeless eyes up at the beast who was right in front of him, its snout so close that each breath was sending warm gusts over his body. Who is this pathetic ninjin standing in front of me, bawling like some worthless child to its parent? A little life returned to Naruto's eyes as his hands baled into fists again, anger flooding his system. My name is Naruto, not ninjin. A growl rippled from the fox's throat as red eyes met purple, and the two silently stared each other down, neither one giving way. No, it isn't. I know Naruto Uzumaki, this weak, feeble child is not the bearer of my father's eyes. Naruto nearly shouted back to the risible tone spoken from the deep, resonating voice, but caught himself before he could, realizing just what the Biju had said. What? The fox rose up on its legs, rising to its full, impressive height that Naruto had the distinct impression was a lot smaller when he was younger. However, its eyes never left the blonde's. Naruto Uzumaki stared me in the face and didn't flinch, the most powerful of the Biju. He refused the power inside of him, choosing to rely on his own. If the others in the room took offense to that, they certainly didn't speak up, too enraptured by the conversation going on. You, some crying little ninjin that has given up, are not him. Naruto stared up at the enormous fox, blinking once, then twice, before wiping away the tears that threatened to continue leaking from his eyes. Maybe you aren't worthy of the eyes given to you if you continue to dishonor my father with this cowardice. The being of chakra leant even closer, so its great snout, the nostril alone large enough to swallow Naruto whole, was nearly touching the boy. I would be more than happy to rip them from your skull. A vicious, menacing grin split the creature's snout as the two silently stared again. Then what should I do? Naruto felt as though he had at least calmed down somewhat, his voice reflected that as it became level and in control again. The Kyuubi just snorted, bringing one of its great paws around until one of its gleaming white claws hung steadily in front of Naruto's chest. With a single twitch of its finger it could have impaled the blonde as easily as it might crush some stray fly. Instead, it lightly tapped him on the chest, pushing the monk back a step from the small, but to a human great, force. Why ask me? Are you not the one always screaming about making one's own path in this world or some other such nonsense? The voice was a growl, but for the Kyuubi the tone was light, almost indifferent, as if it had simply lost interest in the conversation. Naruto paused, staying quiet for a moment before finally looking away from the Kyuubi to his own balled-up fist. He regarded it for a moment before finally allowing it to relax. It was like a wave of relief passing through his body, washing away his frustration and allowing him to think clearly. He turned, walking out of the Kyuubi's cell and back towards the center of the room, pausing in the middle. "Thank you, Kyuubi." He looked up at the ceiling of the room where the various pipes representing his chakra branched off into the cages, what was keeping the seal in check. Mixed in among them were the pipes of the Biju's chakra, and the largest amongst them, the Kyuubi's. He supposed that pipe had always been there, for as long as he had been in this world, it was just as much a part of him as the others. Naruto. The blonde froze, turning slowly to face the Kyuubi again, the great fox having once again descended to lie on its paws, a look of disinterest once again on its face as it trained only a single lazy eye on the monk. It was the first time the Biju had ever actually called Naruto by his name, ever. "You can stop referring to me by that ridiculous ninjin title. My name is Kurama." Slowly, a soft, warm smile spread across Naruto's face as the full implication of that little, seemingly insignificant admission hit him. He gave a firm nod as his body began to fade from view, only his voice staying on, carried as if by some unseen wind. "Thank you then, Kurama." Finally, the Biju were left alone, waiting for their cells to once again split apart as always happened when Naruto left. However, before that happened, Kurama noticed his fellow Biju all looking at him with varying expressions, but most noticeably shock. He let out a low, menacing growl as he stared them all down with one fearsome red eye. "What?" Naruto didn't even have to open his eyes to know his was back in reality. With his mind clear once more, he could feel everything again, the smell of smoldering leaves, the faint sounds of cicada chirps, everything. He slowly opened his eyes, pulling back his foot and standing up straighter, letting out a deep, calming breath to lower his heart rate for real before finally looking back at the masked man. "Remarkable, you didn't even take a second to rein in your emotions. Maybe you're a better monk than I give you credit for." It was funny, after facing the Kyuubi, Kurama, this strange, aggravating man didn't seem to even faze him anymore. "Undo whatever it is you did to Fu." The man cocked his head to the side again, this time in the opposite direction than before, and if he wasn't wearing the mask, Naruto was sure he would have raised an eyebrow. "Oh, but then wouldn't that defeat the purpose of doing it at all? I don't think you seem to get it after all." "What a shame." Naruto let out a slight chuckle at that, a chilling noise when the blonde had his hair shadowing his face to the point where only his Rinnegan eyes, lightly glowing in the dim light of the evening, could be seen. "No, you don't understand, I wasn't asking. You will return Fu to how she was." In a split second the earth behind Tobi, or whatever he didn't like to call himself, erupted into a mass of sandy spikes, each tipped with the ends of one of Naruto's chains. However, as each spike skewered the man's body, he didn't even flinch, nor did he seem to be affected in the slightest. In fact, there wasn't even any blood or sign the spikes had made contact at all, despite them having obviously gone right through him. "Interesting, even with me standing still like this you aimed for non-vital spots like my limbs." The masked man glanced about at the weapons that were supposed to have immobilized him, as if he were simply observing some odd curio. Naruto's eyes narrowed marginally at the revealed ability, tens of possibilities running through his head in a split instant before a light smile formed over his features, something to which the man took immediate notice of. After all, the blonde wasn't supposed to be smiling, he was supposed to be in anguish. It made him wonder just what had happened in that split second. "That's an incredible ability you have there, to completely phase through an object as if your body was completely immaterial." Naruto nodded slowly as if he were thinking through the various possibilities such an ability would allow. It was like the ultimate passive-aggressive tool. Somewhere in the background the explosion had died out, allowing the surrounding area to cool, but more importantly, allowing water vapor back closer to the ground. Naruto could feel it. Around the spikes the man's body was definitely there, but wherever he was physically hit he could phase that part away. selective immaterialism, definitely useful. It would also explain how you are able to stand on solid ground without just sinking right through it. Again, Naruto nodded, slower this time, however. At this point he could almost feel the marginal frown that had passed over the man's features from behind the mask. By now Naruto had retracted the sand spikes, they would do him no good here anyway. However, he raised a hand, splayed out with his palm facing the ground as he pointed it at the masked Akatsuki. What would happen if I made things a bit heavier? Slowly he began to close his hand and instantly the man felt his own body began to get heavier as the gravity around him was slowly but definitely increased. Let's see, if you stay material you'll slowly be crushed into the floor, your body collapsing under its own weight. A slightly cruel spark alighted in Naruto's rippled eyes. This was the man who had nearly taken Fu away from him, who had caused him to fight the girl he loved. However, if you chose to use your technique, you will have to use it across your entire body. I'm not sure which sounds worse, being crushed, or sinking through the earth's surface, a slave to its gravity, until you are crushed by the pressure down there or incinerated by the heat. Slowly the man began to sink to his knees, his mask and the one dark eye hole still trained on the blonde. You wouldn't, you're a monk. Naruto's eyes nearly narrowed, his hand closing a little quicker in response to the taunt. That's a very flexible term. He was about to close his hand, but before he could the Akatsuki member growled, his body beginning to distort in a strange way as it swirled out of existence, centered around the visible but darkened eye. Well played Uzumaki, well played. Finally, the man disappeared but not before allowing Naruto to catch a glimpse of just what lay behind that darkened eye hole. The blonde's eyes widened in surprise at the sight of a fully developed Sharingan eye, barely even paying attention, as the man finally vanished completely as he turned back to Fu. The girl was still cloaked in her Biju's chakra, but it seemed to be visibly straining her to maintain at this point, so Naruto felt he had to act quickly before she could be allowed to hurt herself. He had an idea of just what the man had done now from that little glimpse at his jujutsu, memories of Yagura, and the Sanbai's condition when it was first absorbed appearing in his mind. However, at the same time he couldn't quite be sure. In any case he had to try, consequences be damned. With that in mind he laid his hand against Fu's forehead, making sure his sand was spread evenly across her body as he began to slowly but surely siphon away her chakra. I'm sorry. I hope you can forgive me for this afterwards, Fu Chome. Chapter 81, Embers v. Naruto had a light smile on his face as he slowly opened his eyes. The warm glow of the morning sun was pleasant to wake up to and the soft cushions below him were satisfyingly comfortable. He shifted into a sitting position, stretching his neck until he got the small cracks he was aiming for, sighing in relief. However, after a moment or two the smile slowly slipped from his face, replaced by a frown as he patted the soft, yielding surface beneath him. It most certainly wasn't the much harder earthen bed he had slept on last night. His eyes shot open, any early morning fuzziness vanishing as narrowed, rippled eyes took stock of his situation. He was inside, sitting on a rather plain, but cozy couch in a large office-like room he didn't recognize. He stood up immediately only to note that there was none of the pain he had been expecting from his injuries. In fact, when he looked down, he noticed the 4 large gashes across his torso, and the cuts up his forearms were completely gone. They weren't just healed, even his impressive healing factor he gained from the Q from Kurama wouldn't have done this. This caused his frown to resurface as he tried to rationalize why somebody would capture him only to leave him unguarded, and with his own clothes while healing him of non-life-threatening injuries. The answer quickly became obvious when he tried to reach out through the water vapor in the room to try and gain a better understanding of his surroundings only to draw a blank. He couldn't access his chakra at all. It wasn't like back on Uchiha where he could feel it brimming just under the surface, waiting to be released. He simply couldn't access even a single drop of his own chakra. His eyes narrowed again, mildly congratulating his captors. There was no need for a jail cell after all if the prisoner couldn't use any of his abilities. He got up, already having noticed the lack of the green-haired girl he had gone to sleep with the previous night and adding it to his growing list of concerns. He let none of it show on his face though, as for all he knew he was being watched, and he would definitely not give his captors the satisfaction of seeing him worry. Instead, he made his way over to the large panoramic window on the far side of the office, behind the desk stacked almost to the brim with various paperwork. Naruto wasn't sure whether to be shocked or irritated when he looked out and saw the sprawling village of Konoha laid out before him. "It's changed quite a bit since you were last here, hasn't it?" Naruto's breath silently hitched as that warm, familiar voice floated through the room from behind him. He hadn't even heard the door being opened. Naruto didn't turn, not sure if he actually could, as his eyes traced various new buildings he didn't recognize and others that were still under construction. It's still the same village, no matter how you change its appearance. The soft chuckle he received once again surprised him, as it came from almost right beside him. Once again, he had not been able to hear the man walk across the room. It seemed without his chakra his senses had been completely dulled. The outcome was actually rather unnerving. It was like everything had become dimmer. "Oh no, I like to think that the village is always changing, evolving, trying to become something new as the younger generations rise up to surpass their predecessors." This time it was Naruto's turn to gain a light smile as the familial words sent a wave of nostalgia over his being. "You told me something similar when I was younger, although at the time I suppose I barely listened." The older man chuckled again and Naruto heard the faint sounds of him sucking on his pipe, only increasingly the nostalgia he felt. "No, you never did seem to pay attention, unless it was about the Hokage, or the various stories I told you about the famous shinobi from the past. Although now I suspect you are the one with the stories to tell, am I right?" Naruto finally turned, having to bite back the catch in his throat as he looked up at the face of the one man left he could call family in this village, since the Uchiraka were taken from him. "It's good to see you again, old man." Hiruzen looked down at the young monk, his aged features stretched into a warm, happy smile that seemed to lift years off his features. "And you, my boy?" The two stood there a moment, both just taking in how the other had changed in the time since they had last seen each other. Their last meeting, during the invasion of Konoha 3 years again, had been rushed and left little time for words or greetings, so they took this opportunity to simply be in each other's presence again. "Why am I here?" The silence had to end eventually and Naruto decided he should be the one to get things going again. The longer he looked at his old grandfather figure, the more memories were dredged up, both painful and happy. Hiruzen sighed lightly, taking a long drag from his pipe before tapping it out into a bin next to the desk. "One of the ANBU spotted you out in the forests on his patrol. They have standing orders to report any sightings of you and, if possible, to bring you to the village without using force." Naruto raised an eyebrow at that. So, capturing him while he was asleep wasn't considered the use of force? It sure as heck wasn't the use of persuasion. However, he pushed that aside as he got to the question that was really on his mind. "What about Fu?" Hiruzen was turned away from him, so he missed the slight smile that passed over the elderly Kage's face. It truly made him happy to hear the concern in Naruto's voice for his friend. It was good to see he cared strongly for his precious people still. "The girl who was with you. She's in the hospital right now, being treated for a severe case of chakra exhaustion. She is also under ANBU guard for her own protection." Naruto said nothing to this, absorbing it all in. He said nothing because he wasn't quite sure what to say. It all hit him in this moment. The man standing before him wasn't just his GG, the man he had come to see as a grandfather as a child. He was also the Sandaime Hokage, and had to act as such. The blonde's rippled eyes narrowed slightly, something that didn't go unnoticed by the elderly Hokage. Also, Hiruzen sighed, the smile on his wrinkled features lessening slightly as he looked out over Konoha's picturesque vista that the office window afforded him. "Naruto, when you come to be my age you realize that you can never handle the things you find precious carefully enough." Naruto's eyes only narrowed at that. He hadn't wanted to believe it at first, but it was true. He was simply standing in one giant, gilded cage. "Then my chakra?" Hiruzen turned back to him, pipe in his mouth as he carefully observed the boy. Naruto took notice of the fact his eyes briefly drifted down to his stomach. I understand you have grown very powerful, or at least the reports I get of your various exploits seem to point to that. The old Kage looked up, a hand on his chin as he lightly stroked his small gray goatee. The forces I had stationed across the elemental nations got the occasional sightings of a young blonde monk appearing around the times of instability within their respective nations. He chuckled, tapping his pipe thoughtfully against his cheek as Naruto remained silent. Sunagakure losing its Jinchuriki, no matter how hard they tried to cover it up. The same goes for Takigakure, and there was some kind of trouble in Kumo that was quickly covered up amongst others. Naruto was quietly glad the older man hadn't brought up Mizu no Kuni. I assume it is some kind of seal? Hiruzen looked around, his thick eyebrow quirked up slightly as the very businesslike tone the blonde had donned. The Naruto he knew could never have been that mature, so much like his father, and he didn't even know it. Naruto, as powerful as you are, as powerful as anyone can be, one person cannot be afforded the same security as an entire village. Naruto nodded slowly, although his eyes barely disguised their disagreement. At the same time Naruto noticed that the Hokage would occasionally glance at his Rinnegan only to immediately look elsewhere. So, you think you are doing this for my protection? It wasn't a question and the Hokage knew that, however he chose to take a moment as if in thought all the same. I am doing this for your protection, Naruto, as I always have done. The blonde said nothing, remaining frustratingly calm and subdued. While Hiruzen would not wish for a negative reaction from his surrogate grandson, he still wanted some kind of emotion. What he was getting instead was a cold, almost harsh attitude, made worse by the dispassionate look in his swirled violet eyes. It was an expression of mistrust, which was heart-wrenching for the old man. As this village's Jinchuriki? Hiruzen wanted desperately to deny that such a thing had anything to do with the matter, however to do so would bring up issues he wasn't ready to talk about. After all, for what other reason would the Hokage possibly take such personal interest in an otherwise unremarkable, if not very individual, orphan? At least that was how he knew it must appear to the boy, even if it was not true. If Naruto was a Jinchuriki first in the Kage's eyes, it was basically admitting the kind old man was putting up a persona to get on his good side, and if Naruto wasn't a Jinchuriki first, why make him a big deal in the first place? The moment of silence was all the answer Naruto needed, though, as he turned and began walking towards the door of the office, noticing for the first time that his shikuju had been carefully leant up against the wall. I trust that as long as I don't try to escape, I will be left alone. He didn't need to see Hiruzen to know the old man had nodded slowly, so he simply picked up his staff and walked out. Briefly he enjoyed the amusing thought of how many shinobi must have collapsed from chakra loss to bring it even this far. Oddly though, even with his chakra suppressed, he felt no draw from the staff, no attempt to siphon his chakra. It was curious, but he paid it no mind for the moment, opting to simply walk from the room in silence. Hiruzen stared at the closed door for a good few moments, lost in his own thoughts until a voice finally knocked him out of his own little world. "Brrrr, I feel like the temperature of the room just dropped a few degrees, sensei." The old Hokage sighed, out of frustration or simple exasperation was up for debate. "I assume you were listening in the entire time, Jiraiya?" The aforementioned Toad Sage hopped into the room from the window, a carefree grin on his face as he rolled to an unnecessarily flamboyant entrance. "Of course, sensei, you know me better than that." Hiruzen gave him a non-committal shrug in that way that always seemed to irritate the old sage. "And?" Jiraiya gave a lopsided grin as he casually flopped into the Hokage's chair, playfully spinning around on it a few times. "Well, you can't exactly expect me to come to a conclusion from just that, can you?" Hiruzen simply leveled an even glare at the younger man, causing his grin to lessen slightly, and become sheepish as he rubbed the back of his head. "Well, he's certainly inherited Kushina-chan's chakra reserves if he can carry that staff around with him. It nearly exhausted me just getting it to the village." Hiruzen sighed melancholically at that, leaning against the desk wearily. "And the seal? Did you get a chance to examine it?" At that Jiraiya's face became serious, as it always did on the matter of Fuinjutsu. It was a point of pride for the old Hokage. Well, on that account I'm stumped. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow at that in worry as he looked around at his student. He was a master of Fuinjutsu, and if something was above him then it was definitely a point for concern. Was something wrong with it? Jiraiya shook his head slowly, bearing a perplexed expression, as he stared down at the desk, his mind obviously elsewhere. Nothing, but that's just the thing, it was nearly perfect. Hiruzen's eyebrow raised again, but this time from confusion. Then what's the problem? Jiraiya blinked, coming back from his head as he looked up at the aged Kage. Well, by all accounts the seal should have weakened a lot more by now, at least that's the impression I get from Minato's notes. However, it's perfect, like it had just been applied a few months ago. So, either Minato underestimated his own work, which I doubt, or I'm missing something. Hiruzen waved his hand absently at his student, his own expression becoming distant as he thought on the new information. Think on it and I'm sure it will come. In the meantime, try talking to Naruto when you have the chance, you may have better luck than me. At that, Jiraiya nodded before a sly smile found its way onto his features. Of course, but you know it might be a good idea to give the kid some distance right now. He was basically kidnapped after all, and he knows it. Hiruzen sighed, wishing his student wouldn't put it like that. So I think I'll go do some research while he cools down. A perverted grin came to the man's face as he left the room via the same way he came in, how he always came into the Hokage's office. Once again Hiruzen was left to his own thoughts as he looked out over the panoramic view of his home and the Hokage monument. Particularly he stared up at the face of the man who was supposed to be his successor, drawing strength from it as he so often found himself doing. Minato, I hope I am doing the right thing here. Despite the long time, almost 10 years in fact, since Naruto had properly been in the village, he found he could make his way around easily enough. The paths through the village, both those that would take him in and out of the public eye, were as familiar to him then as they had been as a child. It was simple then for him to take a winding path through various back alleys that kept him away from the village proper. The familiar feel of his Shikuju's wooden texture against his hand was comforting in the absence of his chakra as he finally walked out onto a more populated street. He got a few curious looks from passers-by, no doubt because of his slightly unorthodox clothing and the unique headband he wore, but nothing more. For the most part people seemed content to simply ignore him and go about their own business. It was actually slightly unnerving if Naruto was honest with himself. He tried to put that behind him though as he walked through the open glass doors of the hospital, his nose twitching at the various smells of disinfectants and the sterile atmosphere that made him inwardly cringe. He had hated hospitals as a child, too much sitting still in harsh whites that were painful to look at. Well, I figured it was only a matter of time until you decided to show up here. I actually figured it would be sooner. Naruto froze as for the second time that day a familiar voice cropped up behind him, once again taking him by surprise thanks to his limited senses. What, got nothing to say to your sensei brat? A large, genuine smile worked its way over Naruto's lips as he turned to see Tsunade grinning at him from across the reception of the hospital. It was a very heartwarming scene, one he remembered all too well, that was, until he walked over and found something incredible. Oh damn, well if the gaki didn't get taller. It was true, Tsunade actually had to look up a bit to meet the rippled eyes she was accustomed to. You better believe it's Tsunade-sensei. I guess if you're here I have you to thank for this. He gestured to his scarless chest and forearms with that same smile. It really was good to see Tsunade again, he just needed a familiar face right now. Actually, that was Shizen's handiwork. She's really come a long way since we parted ways. Naruto grinned at the thought of seeing Shizen again. Fu would also be happy to see the older girl. They had gained what some might call a pseudo-sibling relationship in their time together. I could say the same for you, what happened to never going back to Konoha? Naruto could remember the many drunken talks the older blonde had shared with him over that particular subject. However, Tsunade simply donned a mock-irritated expression, as she pulled Naruto into a one-armed hug around his neck that was just a little too tight. Yeah well, some little persistent brat just had to come along and change more than a few of my views now, didn't he? So, you know what, when Sensei offered for me to return, rather insistently I might add. A small vein popped on the woman's forehead as she remembered something obviously irritating. I just didn't have it in me to refuse. She waited for a response only to look down and see that Naruto's face had turned a rather virulent shade of blue. She quickly released him, looking at the younger blonde incredulously as he gasped for air. "What's up with you, Gaki? That much time away from me make you so weak?" "Weak?" Naruto rubbed his throat and gave the woman a dry smile with a small shrug. "It seems you lose a lot of things, resistance being one of them, when your chakra is forcefully taken away." A look of realization glinted in Tsunade's eyes as she, like Hiruzen, glanced towards Naruto's chest. "Ah, so sensei really did put that seal on you. I told him it would be a bad idea but..." Naruto just nodded, cutting her off mid-sentence, having recovered from her overenthusiastic greeting. "But he's the Hokage." Tsunade shrugged helplessly before smiling warmly again, eliciting the same response from the young monk. "In any case, it seems you and four sticking around for a while, better get comfy." Naruto grimaced at that. There were things he needed to do, primarily stopping a fellow Rinnegan user with plans revolving around collecting the Biju, something that could not end well considering their historical penchant for destruction. Being forcefully restrained in a shinobi village that would act more as a target than a deterrent to a man like that wasn't exactly helping that plan. However, he chose to remain quiet, not wanting to worry the closest thing he had to a mother. "So, there's nothing you can do?" Tsunade let out a quick guffaw, slapping Naruto on the back just a little too hard for his temporarily civilian body to be appreciative of. "Sorry Naruto, you're talking to the wrong Sannin." The younger blonde just huffed quietly, rubbing his now aching back with a cringe. He really missed his chakra-reinforced strength right now. "It's ironic really, if I took up Sensei's offer to be Hokage, I probably could have done something for you." The two began walking through the hospital, taking the stairs to the higher floors where the shinobi were treated. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that, straightening up and looking across at the older woman with interest. "You were offered the Hokage position?" Tsunade nodded with a mildly over-exaggerated grimace, sticking out her tongue for good measure in that childish way Naruto had come to expect from the supposed old woman. "Yeah, like I'd take that sucker's job. If Jiraiya can skirt out of it then there's no way I'm taking it on. Kind of a shame though, there aren't that many people you could call qualified in the next few generations. Kakashi maybe, but that lazy scarecrow would never take it up, he's too stuck in the past. That Uchiha kid might have cut it if he hadn't gone all psycho and murdered his clan." Naruto had to frown mildly at Tsunade's rather crass way of summing it up, but he understood she was simply a blunt person. Sugarcoating wasn't her thing. She had seen the harsh realities of the world, and had lived long enough to realize there was no point in covering them up for others' benefit. "So, what is he planning on doing?" Tsunade grinned conspiratorially at him in a way that distinctly reminded him of the time she had asked him to help play a prank of Shizune because the woman was, quote, far too introverted for her own good, and could use some shaking up. The old man's probably cooking up some way to convince me or Jiraiya to take it, but unless the old perv gets that much-deserved castration that's been coming to him, or Konoha starts to become the sake capital of the elemental nations, I'd like to see him try." Naruto had to share a laugh at that. Tsunade had told him a lot of stories from the times when the Sannin were a name to be feared, especially of the Toad Sage's antics. However, more often than not it was Tsunade's reactions or corrections to his behavior she liked to focus on, much to Naruto's chagrin as a man. The two paused as they finally reached a room flanked by two ANBU operatives. However, one look from Tsuanda had them both scattering for the shadows. Naruto had to smirk lightly. It would seem that in the hospital Tsunade might as well have been Hokage from the way she was treated. He hadn't missed the various looks and nods of respect the woman had received on their way up from both the shinobi and the staff. It was no wonder too if what he remembered from his own medical training had been applied to the hospital as a whole. "Alright, I'll let you in for now, but don't expect too much. I don't know what you put that girl through, but she had quite possibly the worst case of chakra exhaustion I've ever seen. I had to put her in an induced sleep just to get her chakra flowing normally again. knowing her though she'll probably be up sometime tomorrow morning. Naruto nodded thankfully as he walked into the small single bedroom, no doubt to make guarding Fu easier. Tsunade turned to leave him alone with Fu before thinking better of it, turning on a heel and lightly grabbing Naruto's arm. Don't you stay in this dreary hospital room all day. I know you may not exactly be feeling the most hospitable towards Konoha right now, but you're here. Here, at least make something of it. Go out, just walk around the village for a while. The older woman smiled knowingly, but not in a condescending manner. Naruto knew she was just trying to be helpful in her own way. Actually, this kind of openly affectionate display would never have happened when they first met, and Naruto felt happy that she could open up to him of all people. You never know what could come from it. With that, the woman finally decided to leave, her twin ponytails swaying behind her as she strutted off, a sense of authority practically flowing from her. Naruto smiled softly as he turned back around, sitting himself down in the single chair set up next to the bed, as if specifically for him. Fu looked peaceful just sleeping there, her chest slowly rising and falling. He gently took her hand and made himself comfortable, tightly locking his fingers with hers as a short, humorless laugh escaped his lips. Well, what have I gotten us into this time, Fu? Naruto wasn't sure where he was going as he aimlessly wandered through the thronging streets of Konoha late in the afternoon. He had stayed in the hospital for a few hours, but had grown a little restless just sitting there in a sterile, too-white room, even if he wanted to keep Fu company. He was beginning to regret it now as he moved through crowds of people with no other purpose than to just keep walking. He didn't appreciate the many odd looks he got from people due to his unique appearance, nor the hushed whispers people directed away from him. Call him paranoid, but he didn't like the idea of somebody recognizing him. After all, 10 years wasn't too long and blonde wasn't the most common hair color in this part of the elemental nations. When he finally couldn't stand it anymore, he began moving to the quieter areas of the village, simply walking down streets that had progressively less people walking about. Eventually, and curiously, he found himself in what appeared to be a completely abandoned area of the village. He didn't recognize it very well, meaning it was an area he was unaccustomed to as a kid. However, he never remembered there being such a desolate area in the entirety of the village. At the same time, though, he couldn't complain about the peace it offered with the tranquil silence and pleasing, homely aesthetic. Finally, he settled down by a large pond that had a small wooden jetty reaching out some way into the waters, sitting down in a meditative position at the end. Slowly he began to draw in deep, long breaths in preparation to do something both unlikely to work and reckless. He had a theory he needed to test out about the seal that was binding his chakra. It may have been suppressing his own chakra, but if he could simply reach out and tap into the energy surrounding him. A smile broke out on the blonde's face as he tapped into the natural chakra permeating the area. He couldn't directly draw it into himself, but as long as he stilled his being and made himself a conduit. His smile only grew as he felt the bonds around his own chakra begin to weaken, if only slightly, as the natural energy naturally tried to flood his body. It failed due to the chakra suppression seal, but like anything, its attempts eroded away at the bonds holding him hostage within himself. A familiar and welcome warmth began creeping into his body. It was weak, but it was still there. However, after a moment or two it just stopped, leaving him with only a tiny trickle of his chakra. He cut off the connection with the natural energy before it could enter his system through the small gap he made in the seal. After all, one needed large reserve to properly balance themselves with senjutsu, and right now his were pitiful at best. It's about time, Naruto. The deep rumbling voice of the Kyuubi filled his head almost as soon as his chakra began to flow again, startling him and forcing him to open his eyes. However, he was no longer on the jetty in the middle of Konoha, but in his seal, staring up at the irritated and very unbarred expression of the fox himself. Pathetic, being so easily caught by shinobi, not to mention how long it took you to break that little seal. Naruto raised an eyebrow as he stood from his meditative position, dusting his clothes from invisible dirt out of habit. I didn't realize you were waiting for me. I might have come sooner. The fox growled at him lightly. However, for once Naruto didn't feel any of the normal hostility. It was like when Tsunade would threaten him, it was just empty. I had just gained some measure of freedom. It's disagreeable to have it taken away so quickly. Naruto continued to look up at the Biju quizzically, forcing it to growl again, as it absently gestured to the lack of bars crossing his cell's entrance. Had you already forgotten what you did in your fit of emotion yesterday, or was it so unconcerning? Naruto's eyes widened as he looked over the crushed remains of the cage's bars, crumpled into a small ball. I did that. The Kyuubi huffed, sending Naruto's robes billowing out behind him, but deigned not to answer. But then, the seal. Have I broken it? The Kyuubi issued a low, rumbling growl as its one open eyes rolled in irritation. Please, there are more pressing concerns right now. With another lazy sweep of his long tail, Kurama brought Naruto's attention around to the new cell adjoining his own. The blonde nearly slapped himself on the spot for forgetting something so absolutely critical. Chome. The blonde dashed around to face the cell in the newly nonagonal room only to come across a most familiar sight as the great insect stared back at him. While the nanabai didn't so much have eyes, it had a grill-like faceplate up on what could be called its head with vertical strips that normally glowed a pleasant yellow. However, right now they were burning a deep, oppressive red. Naruto remembered how this had been with the sanbai and immediately grabbed the bars of the cell, attempting to forcibly push his chakra into the cell to break the genjutsu over the Biju. It seemed he was right in his assumption that Tobi, or whatever his name was, placed Chome under a genjutsu, which was why he couldn't break Fu out of it directly. No. Not now. Naruto once again forced his chakra forward, commanding it to flow through his hands and into the cell. However, with the restricting seal only a pathetic trickle came out, to no effect. Must I really do everything? A great sigh resounded through the seal as Naruto saw one of the fox's long furry tails appear over his head before tapping the metal bars of the cell. All at once the ominous red glow disappeared from the nanabai's faceplate before it took a few confused glances around the room. Fochan? Moments later the beating of its great six wings slowed to a crawl, and it collapsed to the floor of the cage in a similar manner to Isabu's 3 years ago. Naruto glanced across at Kurama, noting his distinct lack of effort despite the fact that Naruto had tried to do the same for the sanbai and nearly collapsed from exhaustion, and it was just the three tails. Admittedly, he had gained a lot more chakra since then, but still, it was awe-inspiring to imagine just how much chakra the fox had. Is Chome going to be alright? The Kyuubi turned to look at him, observing him carefully for a few moments before nodding slowly. The bug will recover shortly. Chome was not under that accursed eye's influence for nearly as long as the turtle, and it is more resilient. In any case, that doesn't matter. We need to talk Naruto. For a moment Naruto felt a whole lot smaller as the Kyuubi stared him down, an incredibly serious look in his eye. Chapter 82, Ember 6. It was eerily quiet within the seal as Kurama fixed his large red eye on the young blonde, as if sizing him up for something. There are a few things we need to talk about. Naruto just nodded straight away. The one thing he had hoped for in his long interactions with the Kyuubi were for them to be more open. He wanted to understand the ancient Biju, all of them. However, for as long as he had known him, Kurama had always been the obstacle preventing that. He commanded due respect amongst his kin, and unfortunately, they followed him more than Naruto could ever hope to sway them. Okay, like what? The great fox huffed lightly, only enough to flap Naruto's Hayori, at the familiar way he now found himself speaking with the blonde. On one level he did feel slightly insulted. On the other hand, though, the young monk had proved time and time again that he really did only care for what was best for him and the other Biju. That Uchiha, or at least the one who bore the Sharingan, he needs to die. Naruto made to speak up at that, but he was quickly cut off with a deep glare from the fox, who was obviously not finished. That accursed mistake of our father's eldest son should have been eradicated a long time ago. Enough time has passed, and the longer their stain remains on this world, the more lives they will corrupt and poison. Once again, the blonde was lightly staggered by the passion the fox had in his utter hatred for the once lofted clan of Sharingan users. You would condemn an entire clan for the actions of just a few? The Kyuubi's gaze dropped down to him again, this time burning with some unidentifiable emotion that hid just beyond the slit of his pupil. You would defend them after they enslaved us? Naruto frowned, quickly shaking his head. You mean after Madara enslaved you? The fox banged one enormous paw down on the floor of his cell, causing the entire seal room to shudder at his now unrestrained anger. It makes no difference, the Uchiha are a blight, none of them can be redeemed, especially not that one in the mask. He reeks too much of Madara himself. Naruto let out a long breath, trying to clear the situation up a little before the Biju's anger got too out of control. It was all well and good riling up the fox when he was young in order to get responses, but back then he had the luxury of a barricade between them. In his current, practically chakraless condition, he would be nothing more than a speck of dust for the Kyuubi's tails to sweep aside. Wait. He paused, thinking on the Biju's words. How would you know if he smelled like Madara? The fox turned so that he was fully facing the blonde, lowering himself until they were at eye level, and letting out another huff of irritation. He obviously didn't appreciate the conversation deviating from killing Uchiha. I said before, your actions in destroying this cage door have afforded me certain freedoms. Naruto's gaze became wary, worrying about the possibilities of a Biju running around his body unrestrained. Was he going to be hearing voices for the rest of his life? In what way? The Biju grinned. It wasn't particularly pleasant smile either. We've become more linked, as distasteful as that sounds. I now hear what you hear, see what you see, and even feel what you feel. Naruto grimaced at that. He had a feeling this was going to make the time he spent with Fu somewhat awkward if he couldn't get over having spectators. The Kyuubi caught the look and growled lightly. Without the bars, Naruto could feel the sound reverberate through the floor. I don't appreciate it all that much either. The feelings of your small ninjin body is disorienting to say the least. Naruto had to concede that the difference between being a building-sized anthropomorphic fox and an average-sized human must be quite odd. You shouldn't complain so much. The less booming but still powerful voice called from across the seal, drawing Naruto and the Kyuubi's attention, or at least Kurama lazily rolled his eye in that direction. Tobi was standing near the bars to her own cell, suddenly appearing slightly meeker with Naruto's Rinnegan and the Kyuubi's commanding gaze solely on her. I would give anything to feel the air on my fur again. Slowly, and in some cases reluctantly, the other Biju and the seal began to nod, agreeing with the sentiment, save for Shikako, but the Tanuki seemed more confused by what was going on than anything. Naruto was a little startled by it all. At that moment he realized just how selfish he had been all this time. So many talks with the Biju he contained, playing with Shikako, chatting with Tobi about random things, trying to get Isobi to come out of its shell, figuratively at least. He had enjoyed debates with Son Goku over a few heated topics, as well as argued with the Gobi until it had finally given Naruto its name, Kokuo. The two now shared a somewhat terse, but workable relationship, similar to how he had been with Kurama at first, which boded well. Saiken confused him greatly, and was incredibly quiet, but all the same he tried to talk to the massive slug. However, in all that time had he really missed the underlying and underrated need each of them felt towards their stolen freedom? I'm just as bad as him, aren't I? Kurama looked around, raising his brow as he saw Naruto with his head lowered, a confused, saddened expression across his features. I'm imprisoning you all, never once asking if this was what you wanted. He shook his head slowly, his hand balling into a fist. I tried to rationalize that I was protecting you, that the Akatsuki couldn't get you, but that was just treating you as objects, weapons to be abused. Naruto was shocked out of his small monologue that had grown louder until he was shouting, quite literally. He stared up at the Kyuubi, who slowly withdrew his long tail that had knocked Naruto to the floor none too gently. Do not compare yourself to that man. The fox's expression confused the young monk. It wasn't angry, just stern was probably the best way to describe it. That man was a coward, using the gifts given to him by our father's blood, and abusing it to bend me and others to his will, treating us like house pets. The ancient Biju lowered himself until he was as close to eye level as he could get with the blonde. You never chose to have me inside of you, and everything that came after was either your misguided actions as a child, or out of what you thought to be best. The fox seemed to realize just how he sounded at that moment, as the stern look was rapidly exchanged for one of mild annoyance. In any case, it is not as though I would wish to be placed in any construct you created through your so-called mastery of the Banbutsu Suzu. Naruto stood up slowly, a frown still marring his features as he thought on what the Kyuubi said. I can still help you although, offer you the same freedom as Kurama has. A few of the Biju seemed roused by that, especially Tobi, and looked ready to agree until the Kyuubi interrupted. That would be a poor idea. The Nibi seemed highly indignant to that as she glared at her much larger brother. You just want the freedom all to yourself. However, the fire seemed to die a little as she was once again placed under the fox's full glare. Don't think me so petty, cat. Destroying the bars of my cell was one thing, to do the same for them all? I do not understand the entire concept of this ninjin seal, but to damage it so much. A light growl escaped his lips, would be ill-advised. The Yondaime Hokage was clever enough to seal me in here, he would have made countermeasures against such tampering. Naruto looked ready to weigh in, but Kurama had not finished yet, bringing his attention once more around to the blonde. Which brings me to my next point. I assume you have some most likely foolish idea of how to break the bonds restraining your chakra. Naruto seemed just a little indignant at that, frowning to himself. It's not foolish. However, after a moment of the Kyuubi and the rest of the Biju staring at him in deadpan silence, he reluctantly nodded, eliciting a grunt from the fox. Well, do not. Naruto looked up in surprise. From all his talk of the indignancy of having his chakra restrained, Naruto would have thought removing the seal would be high on Kurama's priorities. Luckily for him, the ancient Biju saw fit to explain himself. I believe one of the functions of this cage was to slowly filter my chakra into you over time. Without it, all of my chakra has been open to you. Naruto again looked ready to interject, but once again, he was prevented as with another sweeping move the Kyuubi knocked him down again with a lazy flick from his tail. Naruto suspected the old fox was getting more amusement from being able to do that than he was letting on. Yes, I know you have stated your intentions never to use our chakra for whatever prideful reason you possess, but that is far from the point. Right now, that restriction seal is the only thing preventing the full might of my own chakra flooding your being. It had already begun to happen during your conflict with that Uchiha. Naruto frowned, remembering how much crueler he felt as he attempted to crush the man with his Preta path. Whatever your plan is, allow it to happen over time, otherwise, you will probably end up dying, or worse, turning yourself into an invalid. It would be humiliating. Naruto nodded firmly. He had finally gained some measure of the Kyuubi's trust. He wasn't going to squander it by not heeding his advice. I still promise to find a way to let you experience freedom, even if it's only in some small way. He directed this to the other Biju this time, making sure they heard the sincerity in his voice. We know you'll try, Naruto. He smiled thankfully at Tobi. She had always been the most cooperative and friendly of the Biju, like a flaming older sister with surprisingly soft fur. In any case though, whatever your plans, make them fast. That impostor who supposedly bears the sage's eyes needs to be dealt with. There can only be one wielder of the Rinnegan, and if I must place my backing behind one of them, it may as well be the one who does not intend to wield my chakra as a weapon of some kind. Naruto had to smirk lightly at that. It was the closest he had heard in the way of support from the Kyuubi since they had first met all that time ago. You certainly know how to send mixed messages. The Kyuubi gave a long huff, curling up on himself and closing his eyes, as if dismissing the blonde. Your concerns are not mine, Naruto. Deal with the as you must, just do not kill yourself. It would be inconvenient. Naruto just couldn't resist one last jab as he stood back up, walking towards the Kyuubi's cell, until he was within touching distance of the giant fox. His only response is a slight twitching of his great snout, so he took that as a good sign. Is that your way of saying you care? His response was Kurama's eyes cracking open just an inch, and leveling him with a glare more intense than he had done for a long time. The blonde just chuckled sheepishly, taking a quick step back as he decided not to push his waning luck. Alright, but seriously, does this mean we can talk a bit more now? You won't just rebuke my questions? The eye opened a little wider as the fox was silent for a few moments, studying the blonde lazily. I suppose it depends on how I feel, doesn't it? Naruto grinned, sitting himself down on the floor again as he released a small, unnoticed sigh of relief. Great, because this has been bugging me for a while. Have you been getting bigger, or is it just me? The lone open eye continued to search him for a few moments before Kurama let out what sounded suspiciously like an amused huff. The slight upturn of his lips didn't help disguise it either. I suppose you would have to notice sooner or later, wouldn't you? Naruto didn't respond as the Kyuubi took a pause, seemingly collecting itself. This concept of just freely talking with a human was fairly alien to the very old creature. For the longest time it had simply seemed contemptible, before that he was too feared to ever have been approached by one, and before even that. The large fox released a long breath it hadn't even realized it had been holding before turning its head to look at Naruto. The me you saw when we first met was not all of me, simply the aspect of my yang chakra. I was unbalanced, torn and more importantly, weak, only possessing half of my full power. Had I been released from your body at that time, even I am not sure what would have happened, although I suppose I would have lacked the ability to construct a solid body for myself. Again, Naruto stayed silent, even if he was brimming with questions. This opportunity, of the Kyuubi opening up, seemed too good to ruin. Even the Biju seemed intrigued after the self-admission of weakness from their prideful brother. What changed? Eventually Naruto did have to speak up. The Kyuubi had remained silent, seemingly in thought, for a good 30 seconds. A low growl escaped the creature's mouth as he fought with himself for a moment before reluctantly lowering his head. I have you to thank for the return of my other half. Deadly silence reigned in the seal as the Biju stared in shock at the Kyuubi, the very same Kyuubi who had openly admitted his own thanks to another being. When you absorbed my stray chakra from that other monk boy, it contained just a small portion of my yin. It was meager, but it was enough that I could begin culturing it within myself, restoring my full power slowly. The creature looked up for a moment, thinking to himself. I would say in around another half year, I will be restored to how I was in my previous Jinchuriki. At that, Naruto's interest was piqued. After all, the Kyuubi was actually being open with him. He no longer felt restricted in what he could say. Previous Jinchuriki? What were they like? Kurama's attention was brought back down, and for a good few moments he carefully scrutinized the boy, gauging something that Naruto couldn't quite figure out. She cared little for me. In fact, I only spoke with her once. It was when she came within herself to tell me to stay quiet, locked away inside of her where my power could cause no hatred. She was just like the others before her, foolishly believing that love was the only way to suppress my power. The Kyuubi seemed ready to continue, but his ears suddenly twitched, a vaguely irritated expression crossing his features for a split second. It seems we are no longer alone. Naruto was about to question what he meant, but when he blinked, he suddenly found himself staring out at the tranquil pond, no longer in his seal. Hey, I asked what you were doing here. The blonde blinked again, looking around only to see a boy around his age with dark hair and darker eyes staring at him with a dispassionate, but at the same time irritated, glare. He was covered in bandages, most noticeable around his exposed torso, and was walking with just the slightest hint of a limp, which likely meant he had just come back from a mission. At least Naruto assumed the boy was a shinobi from the headband wrapped around the boy's bicep. He also looked vaguely familiar, although Naruto couldn't quite place it, maybe if the hair was a little different. Hey, you some kind of idiot or something? Naruto blinked once again, realizing he had been staring, and quickly adopted a kindly, apologetic smile. Sorry, I suppose I was a little lost there for a moment. The boy gave a rather unremarkable, vague grunt of acknowledgement, walking a bit closer. What are you doing here? This is Uchiha clan property. Naruto looked around in surprise, finally taking notice of the faded fan insignias he had seen dotted about the emptied district of the village. At the same time, he distinctly heard a growl from somewhere in the back of his mind. However, he chose to ignore that. Sorry, I didn't realize. I was simply looking for somewhere quiet to meditate for a bit. It's been a while since I had the chance, and this village is just a little overwhelming at times. The boy scrutinized him for a moment before giving a curt nod. However, his gaze lingered a bit longer on the blonde's hair. Do I know you from somewhere? Naruto raised a brow at that. So, it wasn't just him. However, after another second the Uchiha's eyes widened in realization. You were that boy we met in Nami no Kuni. You had that green-haired girl with you. For some reason Naruto wasn't pleased with how the boy had brought up Fu, but he put that aside. Surprisingly, Sasuke, if he remembered his name right, sat down next to him on the end of the jetty, looking out over the waters. When he realized Naruto was starting at him, he simply glared at the boy. He was rather perturbed though when he realized it had no effect whatsoever. What? Naruto shook his head, turning away and staring over the pond, shrugging casually. Nothing. Nothing, it just seemed like something is bothering you. Sasuke grunted something unintelligible before going quiet for a few moments. So, what do you care? Naruto also stayed quiet, weighing up his options. To be honest, it was none of his concern, but at the same time he had little else to do other than question his tenants before Fu woke up. It wasn't like he had anything particularly planned during his, hopefully short, tenure in the village. Fu had once told him he cared too much. She was probably right. It helps to talk about it. Sasuke looked around at him, his face quizzically arranged, as if he wasn't sure whether to scowl at the idea or simply dismiss it. In either case he just grunted, turning away and staring at his reflection in the crystal-clear waters of the pond. Naruto smiled lightly, tapping the boy on the shoulder. Come on, I'm a monk. It's not like I'll be around for much longer. You might never even see me again after this. Plus, I've been told I offer good advice. Sasuke scowled at his reflection for a moment before his shoulders seemed to slump just a little, a sigh escaping his lips almost inaudibly. What advice do you have for someone who killed his only brother, his only family? Naruto's eyes slowly widened as he took his arm back. Sasuke's voice was a growl and, in his reflection, he could see the boy's Sharingan had activated and was slowly rotating. What happened? Sasuke looked up, the scowl lessening as it was replaced somewhat by surprise. He hadn't expected much past that sentence. Even his teammates had shied away from him when he told them what he had done. It hadn't helped much that he was still covered in the aforementioned brother's blood. Itachi Uchiha. His voice returned to a low growl as his hands slowly clenched into a fist, his features twisting into a mask of fury. The man who murdered my clan, my family. And so for the first time in a long time Sasuke merely vented. He talked for a good 10 minutes, pouring out everything that had happened on that horrific day, all to this practical stranger. Maybe it was because he didn't know him, or maybe it was just because it had been bottled up inside of him for too long, and it finally needed to be let out. When he was finished, he was breathing a little harder, but at the same time he felt lighter, a little less burdened. Naruto on the other hand had a rather troubled expression on his face. He remembered his own meeting with Itachi, as a member of the Akatsuki. He just couldn't place the image of a psychopathic murderer with that calm young man, even if he was a member of the Akatsuki. All the same, it just went to show that you really couldn't judge people on your preconceptions of them. It was almost frightening. So, what now then? Will you carry through with your goal? Restore your clan? Sasuke paused, his brow furrowing as he stared at his hand, closing it and opening it a few times. I'm not sure. For the longest time I thought it would be so easy. I always had a driving force. Gain power, become strong enough to challenge Itachi, defeat him, and reclaim the honor of the Uchiha before restoring my clan to how they should be. Naruto once again heard a quiet snort from the back of his mind and once again chose to ignore it. He had meant what he said to the Kyuubi, about not immediately dismissing a clan for the actions of a single man like Madara. But Sasuke nodded slowly, still just staring at his hand. He could still see it, feel it even, the blood of his brother. Absently he raised a hand and gently touched his forehead, remembering Itachi's smile in his last moments. He nearly jumped when he felt Naruto's hand on his shoulder, the blonde smiling sadly. "It wasn't what you were expecting, right?" Sasuke raised an eyebrow at the other boy, his voice held a certain level of understanding. "I may not be able to compare to losing my entire family in a single night, but as advice from someone who has experienced both the horror of loss and the hollow feeling of revenge, don't push people away." Sasuke blinked as Naruto stood up, feeling compelled to join him as the two stood on the end of the short pier. Naruto actually gave the boy a smile as a short chuckle escaped him, confusing the dark-haired Uchiha. "I suppose if I was younger, I might parrot off a saying from one of my sensei, just expecting the words to be wise." He shook his head slowly, a sad smile etching his features for a moment. "However, words spoken that aren't yours are just as hollow as a Pyrrhic victory, so I'll say something that I spent a long time thinking about after killing the man who took away the first girl I loved." If Sasuke seemed shocked that Naruto had killed a man, just a blonde monk he had never really thought much of during that time in Wave, he didn't show it. He saw it in the blonde's expression, the way he held himself. He could see the loss the other teen had suffered, just like him. However, he did show surprise when Naruto finally looked up, capturing him for a moment on those vibrant rippled eyes. "Don't push away the people closest to you. It doesn't make you stronger to carry your burden alone. While no amount of time will wipe away the memories, having people to stand by, to care for you, will make them seem just that little bit less important." Sasuke blinked, snapping himself out of his semi-trance at the surprise over the blonde having a Dojutsu. He had never managed to see his eyes in Nami. However, before he was able to reply he was cut off as a new voice entered the picture. "Hey Sasuke." The Uchiha turned to see Sakura and Kiba running up to him, although it appeared more like Sakura was dragging the Inuzuka along with her against his will. When they stopped, Sakura smiled brightly at the young clan heir as she pushed Kiba forward, rather forcefully too. "Sasuke, I'm glad we found you. Kiba and I had something we wanted to ask you." She leveled a particularly frightening glare at the young dog lover, at least to those who knew of Sakura's temper. "Didn't we, Kiba?" Kiba quickly nodded, his eyes widened in fear, unable to turn away from Sakura's frightening visage until she turned to smile sweetly at Sasuke. "Ahia, I guess, if you want to go get some akisoba or something I suppose, I'll—" The brown-haired boy lightly rubbed the back of his head, glaring weakly at Sakura, who simply continued to be the picture of utter innocence, clenched fist hidden behind her back notwithstanding of course. "We would like it if you came along." Kiba rolled his eyes as he finished, already predicting his Uchiha teammate's typical response of a disinterested, frustratingly vague grunt. "Yeah, sure." Kiba waved his hand nonchalantly, already turning to leave. "I told you he wouldn't go for it, Sakura, but you just didn't listen." The Inuzuka paused for a moment, the gears in his head visibly turning for a moment to the point where smoke was almost visibly pouring from his ears. "Wait, what?" Sasuke just nodded, hands in his pockets as he projected as good an air of disinterest as he could. I said I'll go, just let me." He turned to say one last thing to Naruto only to find that the blonde had somehow vanished while he was distracted. Never mind, let's just go." "Akisoba, right?" Kiba just nodded dumbly as he allowed Sasuke to walk right by him, a dumbfounded expression firmly plastered on his face. "You going to stand there all day, dog breath?" That quickly snapped Kiba out of his confusion as he swiveled angrily on his heel. "Hey, who you calling, ow?" He once again rubbed his head as Sakura happily skipped past him to catch up with Sasuke, just glad the boy didn't seem to be isolating himself anymore. From a few houses away, partly hidden by the late afternoon shadows, Naruto watched with a small, satisfied smile as the three friends walked off into the village together. Even if Sasuke seemed a little cold, he hoped their short talk would at least help the boy to think and come to his own conclusions. The teen was at a dangerous crossroads, but Naruto was certain with the support of his friends he would make the right choice. Naruto had been there as well, and without the people he cared about he could have taken a wholly different and much darker past. His yummy half was proof enough of that. I still say my method would be easier. The little Uchiha wouldn't have to worry about turning to a darker path if his head was a few hundred feet from his body. Naruto grimaced as he placed 2 fingers on his temple, feeling a slight headache coming on as he walked back into the village in the direction of the hospital, or more specifically Fu. Having Kurama speaking directly to him without having to enter the seal was definitely going to have to take some getting used to, especially if it was only to make comments like that. Naruto was roused from his light sleep not by the rays of the early morning sun through the hospital room's blinds, but as the hand he was holding suddenly tightened its grip. Instantly the blonde was alert as Fu stirred, her amber eyes blinking open to the side of messy blonde hair and concern-filled violet eyes that had her naturally smiling. However, like him, she immediately noticed the comfort of the bed beneath her, a stark contrast to what she could remember, which was not all that much, and her smile slipped away. Naruto? What happened? Where are we? She sat up only to have her head swim at the sudden elevation. Her body felt a lot lighter all of a sudden and strangely cold. It took the better part of the morning for Naruto to explain what he knew of the previous 2 days' events, including her control by the unknown Uchiha, her attacking him, which he played down greatly for her own benefit, and their capture by Konoha. By the end of it the girl had donned a deep, thoughtful expression that the monk knew to mean she was thinking everything through carefully. I see, then for now we are captives in Konohagakure, but we are able to move around freely. I presume there is a similar seal on me as there is on you. Naruto shrugged. He wouldn't have imagined Tsunade allowing something like that to occur under her watch, but then again, who was to say how long it had been until Fu was placed under her care? However, Naruto couldn't help but feel concern for the mint-haired girl. Her voice seemed a little hollow after the revelation that the Nanbai was no longer inside of her. Fu. The girl looked up at him, smiling with melancholy on her soft features, squeezing his hand for comfort. You don't need to feel so worried, Naruto. I will miss Chome, but it is not as though we will never meet again. Naruto returned the smile, nodding quickly. As a former Jinchuriki, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that she could be drawn into the shared mindscape of the Biju. But then, there is no chance of returning her to me? I still want to help carry your burdens however I can, even if I do not see the Biju as such. Naruto shook his head slowly, his gaze turning downwards. He had plenty of time to think about this and talk to Kurama while Fu was asleep. No, when Chome was extracted the seal that bound her to you was rendered useless and basically fell apart. Without it I would just be forcing her chakra into your system, most likely killing you. Fu just nodded her understanding. Neither of them was seal masters to say the least, and she doubted Konoha would lend them one just to perform a trivial switching of Jinchuriki. She sighed slowly before swinging her legs out so that she could stand up, Naruto instinctually rising with her, her hand still grasped firmly in his own. She briefly looked down at that connection, faltering for a moment as she found herself unable to lift her head back up to meet his eyes. Naruto, I am sorry. Naruto smiled confusedly at her, drawing her in closer only for her to take a step back. She didn't let go of his hand though. For what, Fu? If anything, I should be apologizing. Fu quickly shook her head, still unable to lift her gaze. No, I attacked you. I can't imagine how it must have felt to have to fight me. I could never. She didn't finish, but Naruto knew what she meant. Already with Shizuku, and now with me. I should have been faster, not fallen for that man's trap. Naruto felt the grip around his hand tighten when she mentioned the unknown Uchiha. However, anything more Fu might have said was cut off as Naruto pulled her in close, carefully wrapping her up in his embrace. Fu, please, you're safe and alive, that's all that matters. A solitary tear wound down the contours of the former Jinchuriki's face as she accepted the hug, pulling her body as close to Naruto's as she could manage, a short laugh escaping her lips. Maybe this isn't so bad after all, being captured. Naruto raised a quizzical eyebrow, but let the girl continue. He was certain she was probably just venting. Perhaps, for a little while, we could just pretend to be normal. No chakra, no life-changing journey for peace and understanding. No Akatsuki hunting us. Naruto sighed into the girl's hair, a light, saddened smile on his face. Fu. Another laugh escaped the mint-haired girl's lips, although it sounded more like a sigh than anything else. I know, it's selfish, too selfish, but... She slowly released the blonde, stepping back a moment before gently raising a hand to brush against the blank headband he wore. You bear so many burdens, carry so many dreams on your back. She gently slid the horned headband off his head, smiling lightly when his messy hair fell about his eyes, that just this once. She reached around and gently removed his earring, quickly following it by slipping the necklace she had given him over his head. You can just be Naruto Uzumaki. Finally, she took the shikuju he held in his other hand, gently prying it from his grasp before setting it to one side against a wall, and nothing else. Naruto had a vaguely amused smile playing across his face, quickly mirrored by the girl in front of him. Normal? Fo nodded slowly, their eyes never leaving one another. Either they had gotten exceptionally good at hiding their pain or they had really gone a little bit insane to be smiling after everything they had just been through. It was most likely combination of the two if they were being perfectly honest with themselves. For just a few days. Naruto looked up thoughtfully. He needed a while to slowly integrate Kurama's chakra into his system anyway, and Fo would no doubt require time to grow accustomed to the sudden change of not being a Jinchuruki. I suppose that wouldn't be too bad. What's the worst that could really happen in a few days? Deep metallic gray eyes opened slowly, revealing the concentric rings around the small pupil as the owner of the eyes looked up from their thought, the rain falling across their face not bothering them in the slightest as they felt a presence approach. Zetsu. Their voice was deep, the kind that naturally commanded attention, yet oddly emotionless, more appropriate for a puppet. I assume you coming here means the Kyuubi Jinchuriki has finally stopped moving. The completely black being behind the owner of the rippled eyes nodded, his single yellow eye betraying nothing. Yes, Pain-sama, he is currently in Konoha. If Pain had been any other man he might have laughed from the irony, however the stoic leader of Amigakure merely stood, his long black cloak, proudly adorned with red clouds flapping in the wind and rain. How appropriate. Zetsu shuffled uneasily behind the orange-haired man. The black being always felt uneasy in this man's presence. Should me and Tobi go capture him? The smallest of smiles slowly played across AIM's leader's features. No, I think I will go myself this time. It was only after Zetsu left after a quick nod that Pain returned to his musings, staring out over the rain-swept vista of his village. So, the two legacies of the sage finally meet. I wish to see your convictions for myself, Naruto Uzumaki. Chapter 83, Ember 7. Naruto had decided he rather liked this whole acting normal concept Fo had suggested for their time here in Konoha. For some reason that was hard to explain he felt lighter, without all of his various trinkets that had been given to him across his travels. It felt as though the dreams those small, normally insignificant items represented could simply be set to the side for now until he was ready to pick them up and continue on again. The village itself was also different to how he remembered it. It would seem that 10 years was longer than he thought, as without his headband or shikuju Naruto had found not even a single glance sent his way. Right now, he and Fo were sat in a small out-of-the-way cafe somewhere not quite in the middle of the village where there would be hustle and bustle rushing past them constantly, but not quite on the outskirts where it would be too quiet. He gently nursed his tea, smiling lightly at the flavor. It certainly wasn't the best he had ever had, but it was far from the worst. It was simply normal, and Naruto found that perfectly fitting with the atmosphere. He set the cup down and looked across at his companion, unable to help the small amused smile that flickered across her lips when he saw she wasn't exactly sharing his sentiments. Why is he still here? Currently the mint-haired former Jinchuriki was doing her absolute very best to burn a large hole into the man sitting at the table with them with nothing but the power of her own vision. The man in question didn't seem too bothered with the glare, happily drinking the small dish of sake in front of him, as if he was used to this type of treatment. With his kind of reputation and the way Naruto had first met the man, it would have been incredibly unsurprising. The man dipped the tray back, slurping down the last of the sake with all the manners of a drunken tsunade before slamming it back down onto the table with a happy grin. What's the matter, cutie? You must really want some alone time with your boyfriend. If it was possible, Fu's glare managed to increase in intensity to the point where other patrons began to look around, feeling some kind of chilling presence they couldn't explain. Again, though the man simply shrugged off the look, even if he did seem somewhat surprised a girl that young could muster this kind of killing intent and focus it at him so effectively, like a miniature tsunade. Now that particular thought was enough to send a small shiver running down his spine. Naruto finally decided to intervene before the other patrons of the little cafe decided to leave. He was uncomfortable enough as it was with the attention they were already garnering. Now Fu, you can be a little nicer. The man sitting across from them smirked at the younger girl in a way that was far too smug for his own good. After all, Jiraiya is going to buy us lunch. The smirk slipped off his face in an instant as the Toad Sage's eyes went wide, staring down at the very large lunch Naruto and Fu had ordered for themselves. They were each Jinchuriki after all, their metabolisms were quite a bit higher than most normal shinobi. Even if Fu no longer contained her tenet, it seemed that, like with Gaara, she had retained many of the more positive aspects of her Biju, such as her stamina, healing and durability. It remained to be seen if the girl could still manifest her chakra wings, but they wouldn't be able to tell until Naruto could remove the suppression seals. Hey, I don't remember agreeing to that, Gaki. Naruto simply turned to gaze at the much larger man, his eyes scrunched up into narrow lines as a serene yet unwholesomely vicious smile graced his features. But it's the least you could do after the small incident this morning, right, Jiraiya? Somewhere, in a place completely unrelated to the elemental nations, or possibly even that dimension, a young-looking purple-haired woman sweeping the backyard of the inn she lived in smiled coldly, feeling that somewhere, a pervert was being punished. Aha, right. Jiraiya just nodded slowly, a drop of cold sweat slowly sliding down the side of his face. The smile the blonde was giving him was far more terrifying than any killer intent-infused glare he had gotten from a scorned woman. The worst part was he couldn't explain why. There was no killer intent, no outward sign of irritation, just the smile. Naruto, however, simply nodded in satisfaction, returning to his cup of tea with a less terrifying smile. And you can finish making up for your illicit activities later. Somewhere, that same purple-haired young woman looked up to the sky, a single tear rolling down her smiling face. She knew that out there, somebody understood her. Jiraiya, on the other hand, firmly decided not to repeat the circumstances that had put him in this situation. Namely, him peeping on the women's hot springs when Fu just so happened to be relaxing in the steamy, fenced-off area. Somehow, even with his chakra blocked and heavily suppressed, the young blonde had managed to find the man, appearing out of nowhere and defying reason when he managed to actually sneak up on Konoha's self-proclaimed super pervert. Yeah, sure. Jiraiya just nodded along to it dejectedly. He hadn't actually planned on the kid's girlfriend being there when he peeped. It was just one of those coincidences. However, it hadn't exactly made an excellent first impression on the boy, and to be honest, the boy didn't need even more reasons to be distrustful of Konoha, without his own girlfriend's privacy being put into question. Apparently, though, the beating he had received at the hands of the many angry kunoichi that had been alerted to his illicit activities wasn't good enough for Naruto. He had heard the kid had spent some time with Tsunade before she came back to the village, but it was as though he had inherited her intense hatred for all things perverted. So, you really are Naruto, huh? None of them had spoken for a good few minutes as an awkward silence settled over the table, so it came as a small surprise when Jiraiya finally spoke up, his voice oddly subdued. Naruto simply sipped at his drink, his face still portraying the epitome of uncaring as he had promised himself he would when dealing with shinobi of the village. He was under no illusions that the Hokage would be doing his utmost to try and form bonds between himself and those in the village in order to gain either his trust or his loyalty, even if only by proxy. That is my name. Jiraiya let out a humorous chuckle, obviously finding something amusing about that which only seemed to irk Fu. She liked Naruto's name. You're very different than that little knuckle-headed blonde I remember running around the village when he was nothing more than a brat. Naruto made sure to take an extra long sip of his tea, even though the flavor had long since lost interest to him. A lot has changed since then. I was in this village for less than half my life already, and most of those years I was far too young to remember. Not to mention that much of the memories I do remember are better left forgotten. It was subtle, but Naruto just about managed to catch the much larger man wince at that. The blonde found that interesting. The white-haired pervert seemed to struggle with something for a moment before taking a swig of his sake. You know, once I heard you left, I searched for you. Naruto merely quirked an eyebrow, his frosty demeanor not dropping for a moment. He just refused to show anything towards the people keeping him in chains, as invisible as they were. I imagine you would. A hidden village without its Jinchuriki is greatly weakened after all. Another wince from the older man that Naruto found interesting, regret or guilt maybe. No, not like that. However, Jiraiya trailed off, unable to articulate what he wanted. No, needed to say. His sensei had been adamant that Naruto not find out about certain things yet, and he was so limited in what he could say. Once again, like with Hiruzen, Naruto took the man's silence for what he could only take it to be, lies and hidden truths. He really shouldn't have been surprised from shinobi of a hidden village. It was how they operated after all. Why are you here, Jiraiya-san? Are you here to try and install bonds of trust between us? I assure you that as long as my chakra is chained away within myself, those bonds would be like building a house atop sand. Perhaps you are here to inspect my seal, to make sure the Kyuubi has no more power than it should over me? Or are you interested in a student of your teammate? Tsunade-sensei has already told me a lot about you. Jiraiya tried to grin at that, but it was hollow at best. Each question was like a little knife in his back being slowly twisted. All good, I hope? Naruto simply blinked in that same cold manner as the large man's head fell down again, still searching for his own answer to the question. Maybe I could train you? That would be good, wouldn't it? Training from two of the Densetsu no Sannin? The request felt as desperate as it sounded, and Jiraiya knew it was a weak hope at best. However, in his mind there still had to be something of that little blonde he remembered watching that seemed so eager to fall among the ranks of the legendary shinobi of the past. Naruto for his part let a small sigh escape through his lips, blowing the steam from his tea gently outward as he held it near his mouth. I am not a shinobi, Jiraiya-san, nor do I wish to be. Again, the man seemed to subtly wince at the formal suffix, finding it uncomfortable to talk to the boy like they were nothing more than two total strangers. I have no interest in learning jutsu like the ones you have to offer. I trained under Tsunade-sama, because I saw that her healing was the best way to protect that which was precious to me. Jiraiya didn't miss that slight glance Naruto gave towards Fu, a twinge of pride entering his eyes briefly as he remembered seeing that same look of concern and love in the eyes of a similar blonde. But sometimes the best or only way to protect something is with your own power. This time Jiraiya found his voice to hold a little more confidence, finally seeing a way into spending some time with the boy. However, far from the reaction he was expecting, Naruto's eyes narrowed even farther, his hand naturally clenching into a fist. And sometimes that right there is the very reason we lose something precious in the first place. Being too focused on gaining power or failing to understand what we already have. In Naruto's eyes it was almost like Shizuku's phantom blood was really there on his hands, dripping away on the floor in that ever-constant, rhythmic pattering that had haunted him, however subtly, since her passing. At that moment, as Jiraiya saw that pain look enter the young monk's eyes, he knew he had failed the boy. He had obviously experienced a great deal of loss in his time, and he knew it was, in part, because Jiraiya wasn't there for him at the beginning. Maybe you're right. Jiraiya's face was a mask of troubled expression as he stood up from the table, absently throwing down more than enough money to cover both his and the two teens' food. However, before he left, he gave one last glance back at the blonde and the girl that had shuffled around to sit closer to him, a brief smile passing over his features. But maybe there's still time. He spoke the last part as nothing more than a whisper as he walked away, suddenly having a lot to think about, the questions he was going to ask about the Rinnegan completely forgotten. When the Toad Sage was no longer in sight, Naruto allowed the cold mask he had been wearing to fall away. It was more for appearances at this point anyway. Plus, he was only in the company of Fu now, so hiding his emotions from the girl he loved was counterproductive. He didn't particularly care that there were ANBU hidden in strategic positions around them. They could report whatever they liked back to their Hokage. Perhaps it would not have been so bad to take up the man on his offer of training. Naruto raised an amused eyebrow at Fu. As far as she had come emotionally, she was still a very tactical and forward-thinking person deep down. However, he couldn't help but chuckle when he looked around only to see her scowling in the direction the white-haired Sannin had gone. Even if he is a pervert. She looked at him, her ever-lengthening hair moving so it covered one of her eyes in a manner that added an air of mystery and seduction to her appearance even if it was unintentional. Inwardly Naruto knew this girl could ask of him almost anything, and he would do his best to move the earth to get it done. At the same time the girl had no idea of the influence she had over what could potentially be one of the most powerful men in the elemental nations. Really, you would have me learn from somebody other than Tsunade-sensei? Naruto held a hand over his heart, giving an over-exaggerated expression of hurt that made Fu smirk lightly. How could you ask me to betray her so? After a moment or two both of them began laughing, an air of serenity coming over the both of them. However, after a moment or two Fu brushed her hair back over her ear and gave Naruto a slightly more serious expression, somewhat subverted by the smile she couldn't seem to remove from her features. But really, it could be an opportunity to have the seals on our chakra removed. The verdette spoke in a hushed tone so their watchers wouldn't overhear, and Naruto had to admit the idea had merit. As for Jiraiya to teach him anything, he would require the use of his chakra. It wouldn't work. Jiraiya is a Sannin for a reason and a capable practitioner of Fuinjutsu. Naruto gestured to his stomach where he suspected the restraining seal to be. I have already learned not to underestimate him when it comes to that particular field of the shinobi arts. The blonde shook his head slowly, his expression too becoming more serious. No, it would be best that we did this on our own when we are ready. The seal needed to be removed slowly anyway. It was still too dangerous to remove lest he be rushed by the Kyuubi's caustic chakra. Naruto looked up from his thought when he felt a hand lightly brush his shoulder, seeing Fu smile at him softly. Okay, we'll move as fast as you want to. You know I'll do anything you want me to. The two shared that smile for a brief moment, knowing that for one another there was nothing too large to ask, yet at the same time, it would never be asked of them. There was a brief pause before the two's lips met, each leaning further into the contact as Naruto's arm made its way to its natural resting place around Fu's waist and her hands came up to the back of his head, to deepen the kiss. They were still smiling when they parted, a thin trail of saliva bridging their lips like their bodies weren't ready to part just yet. I love you, Fu. The girl's smile didn't grow anymore, but it was like a spark was lit behind her vibrant orange eyes. And I love you, Naruto. The pause was significantly shorter this time before the two leaned in, and were once again lost in each other's embrace. Izumo and Kotetsu, nicknamed the Eternal Chunin by a few of their colleagues that had long since moved up the rankings to Jounin, sat where they could almost always be found, in front of Konoha's gate. They were always here because the Hokage had little else to do with them. They rarely took missions, and even more rarely ones outside of Hai no Kuni. So, there they were, lounging behind the desk that new entrants to the village, such as merchants and shinobi coming back from missions, all had to go through in order to enter Konoha. This was not because they weren't powerful. As a duo they were actually quite formidable, and their rank didn't particularly reflect their ability to go toe-to-toe with many Jounin. Nor was it because they were incompetent as many would believe. In fact, most of their paperwork was done promptly and correctly. They had an important job after all. They had to make sure there were no scruples with incoming entrance information to weed out potential spies. The simple fact of it was that the two were just very lazy, thus the reason for what they were currently doing. Got any twos? In their defense, it had been a particularly slow week for them. It was approaching the middle of summer and the heat in Hai no Kuni made traveling uncomfortable for many merchants, so there wasn't much traffic through the gate. Nope, go fish. Kotetsu grimaced as he was forced to pick up another card from the pack. He was now entirely sure his partner and friend since the academy was cheating. He was so focused on the game though that he didn't notice the presence behind him until it was right beside the desk. Oh hey, welcome to Konoha. sign your name and reason for visit here. The Chunin absently pulled one of the forms from the neat stack, and handed it to the man behind him without even looking. However, when he looked up to continue the game, he only saw Izumo looking at something behind him, his eyes widened in shock and fear. Where is the Kyubi Jinchuriki? Kotetsu quickly turned around, only to blanch at the sight before him, the iconic symbol of the Akatsuki embroidered on a plain black cloak. All the Chunin-level shinobi and above had been notified of their status as S-ranked criminals in case the organization decided to come to Konoha in search of the Kyubi Jinchuriki. It seemed that day had come. What? Both Chunin found themselves paralyzed by the man in front of them. His mere presence radiated power, and his cold gaze seemed to stare right through them. He was tall, with long orange hair that hung down in a long bang to the left side of his face like many Yamanaka. However, with the many black piercings across the man's face, it was certain he was not of the Mind-Walking clan. However, that wasn't the worst of it. When Kotetsu looked up, he found himself staring into a cold set of rippled steel-gray eyes. Where is Naruto Uzumaki? The man's voice was hard and blunt, emotionless even, and he didn't seem to blink even once, just boring his gaze into the frightened Chunin. After a moment of hesitation, though, the Rinnegan bearer narrowed his eyes at the same moment Kotetsu widened his. The Chunin looked down in disbelief at the long black rod that had pierced straight through the desk and through his stomach, steadily being stained crimson. In the next moment, the Akatsuki member turned to look at the other gate guard with precisely the same even gaze. Where is Naruto Uzumaki? Hiruzen Sarutobi, Sandaime Hokage of Konohagakure, was running across his beloved village's rooftops. Around him hundreds of shinobi had mobilized, darting this way and that to relay messages, fortify strategic locations and ferry away civilians to safe points and bunkers. All of this because of one man, or at least that was what the intelligence would have him believe. The village had been alerted to the man's presence as soon as he had passed through the invisible barrier surrounding Konoha, yet he had walked right through the first engagement team, and to add insult to injury, simply walked right through the front gates. The elderly Hokage landed in a surprising feat of agility on a street he knew all too well, just like he knew every inch of the village that had been his home for 7 decades. At the other end, the very same man his troops were mobilizing for stood, a Jounin Sarutobi knew to be called Hitomi Koyuki, held firmly in his grasp around the neck. The old man's gaze hardened when the Akatsuki member noticed him, callously snapping the neck of the Jounin and almost absently casting her aside with incredible strength. Ah, the Sandaime Hokage, I had wondered when you might appear before me. The man looked around to the crumpled form of the Jounin behind him before returning his steely, even gaze to the legendary figure in front of him. I must commend you. Your shinobi refused to tell me anything on the whereabouts of the Jinchuriki. Perhaps it is not that they do not know, but rather you have kept it even from them. Hiruzen tensed as the man turned to fully face him, his full attention now on the much younger man. What do you want, Akatsuki? Hiruzen knew the answer was obvious, but he still thought it best to ask. Every second this man was occupied, his own forces had more time to prepare. I want Naruto Uzumaki, he is instrumental in our plans. Hiruzen's eyes narrowed as a body that had not seen true combat in some time readied itself. He is not in the village. He has not been for 10 years. The man's gaze didn't change, it seemed he was almost incapable of doing so. We shall see. In your prime you were once called the god of shinobi. I would very much like to test that moniker. Sarutobi instinctively leapt back as the man slammed his hands into the ground, and an enormous sealing matrix spread from the contact. The man practically radiated power and authority, and the barrier team had told him his chakra levels were just absurd. The wizened Hokage knew better than to underestimate such an opponent. However, what came out of that white cloud of smoke was no summon, but 6 other people, 5 more men with those same black piercings covering their body, and a dispassionate blue-haired woman. All of them wore the Akatsuki cloak, and even more worryingly the 6 men each bore the Rinnegan. We are pain. We are God. We will have the Kyubi Jinchuriki. Naruto and Fu moved against the flow of evacuating civilians, the panicking men and women rushing past them in the direction shinobi were calling or pointing to. The two teens ignored their calls. Naruto's eyes narrowed as he moved in the direction of the massive, unfamiliar chakra he could feel. It had begun so suddenly, shinobi swarming up out of their positions on a seemingly invisible signal that Naruto actually knew to be hawk messengers. Then all of a sudden enormous and gruesome creatures began to spring up around the village, their arrival heralded by enormous clouds of white smoke. However, Naruto recognized the unusual summons with their black piercings, but more importantly their Rinnegan eyes. The leader of the Akatsuki had come to Konoha. Their ANBU guards had vanished, going off to help with the defense of the village against the unknown assailant. Even as Naruto thought this, Jounin and Chunin were rushing towards each massive summon, hoping to take them down quickly so they could not do much damage to the village. Naruto knew that it was just a distraction though. The Akatsuki wanted him and Fu, they didn't care in the slightest about Konoha. The less shinobi in the way of their search the better, and the Rinnegan user could simply keep spawning summons to keep people occupied. Naruto, what are you doing? Naruto tried his best to ignore Kurama's voice in his head as he worked his chakra throughout his body, pushing it around and around as he felt the suppression seal get weaker and weaker. The fox growled angrily in his head as he felt his unrestrained chakra naturally move into the boy's freed-up coils, despite his best efforts to rein it in. If you continue to loosen the seal this quickly you could die. The fox's voice sounded more like a statement than genuine worry, but Naruto could still hear the slight confusion in the old Biju's tone. None of them are prepared for a Rinnegan user, they don't know what we can do. If I do nothing many people will likely die. His response was another growl as he and Fu made for the rooftops to speed along their journey. Even for these people? The ones who shunned you. You would throw away your own life? Naruto smirked inwardly as he sped up, once again feeling his chakra flow free and thick through his system. Who said anything about throwing away my life? Kurama was silent at that, but inwardly he huffed to himself, telling himself that he didn't care if the silly human got himself killed through his own feat of idiocy. However, as he felt his chakra move away from him and into the young blonde, a small twinge of something unidentifiable made itself known in the back of his mind. Fu, the Rinnegan user wouldn't have come alone. Nobody could be so arrogant to think they could take on an entire hidden village by themselves, could they? I will handle the leader if I can, you deal with any other members of the Akatsuki you can. Fu nodded quickly. She understood that it wasn't Naruto thinking she couldn't hold her own, but she had seen firsthand how far out of her league a Rinnegan user could be. That didn't mean she would do her best to help the man she loved. This was quickly reinforced when Naruto stopped them on a random roof and turned to face her. Please, don't do anything to put yourself in danger if you can avoid it. Fu felt her heart flutter at the sheer concern and worry in the blonde's voice as he reached over to touch her gently on the stomach. At once she felt whatever effect the seal had over her fade, and her chakra rush throughout her being like a veritable flood of energy. It wasn't as much as she was used to, and it was strange not to have that other source constantly tickling her senses, but she would manage, she had to. Only if you can promise the same. Naruto simply gave the girl a sad smile, both knowing that this would likely be the biggest challenge he had ever faced. He quickly pulled her into a hug, gently brushing back her hair on the other side of her head as he reveled in her warmth for a few moments. I will come back to you. Fu nodded, her eyes closed in an attempt to fully capture this moment, before Naruto pulled away, and his warmth was gone. The girl took a moment on that empty rooftop to calm herself, readying her chakra and loosening up her muscles for what was to come. It was difficult, but if these people were in the way of a future where she and Naruto could be happy, then she had to succeed. Naruto knew he was in the right place as he passed over a completely destroyed building, nothing left of the once proud structure but rubble and debris. Dust clogged the air, and the sounds of shinobi fending off the enormous summoned creatures rang throughout the air. When Naruto finally saw silhouettes through the dust, he readied himself, about to push past what was left of the suppression seal. However, as the dust cleared for a moment, the sight before him was enough to make him hesitate out of shock. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the Hokage, the man he could once call Gigi, was pinned to the ground, bloodied and beaten. An eerily familiar black rod was skewered through both his hand in a way that held them both in front of him. Next to him a man stood staring at the elderly Hokage, his long black cloak barely even tarnished and the red cloud still undamaged in the least. Slowly the man turned, his spiky orange hair, so similar to how Naruto's might have been without his ponytail, blew in the breeze. Steely gray Rinnegan eyes met vibrant purple ones, and for a moment it was as if the entire world stood still. Two sets of the most powerful dojutsu to have ever existed gazed at one another as perfect silence reigned. "So, you are the Kyuubi Jinchuriki, the other bearer of the sage's eyes." Naruto said nothing as his face slowly twisted into a completely emotionless mask, his hair falling forward to lightly shadow his eyes, so that his own Rinnegan glowed ominously. "I had wondered how a meeting between two gods would take place. Somehow in the shattered remains of the symbol of the old system seems appropriate." Naruto still remained silent as his chakra finished opening up the last of the suppression seal, much faster than was advisable. A near-visible glowing aura of chakra began to coalesce around him as the violent energies of the Kyuubi flooded his being. "I had hoped we would have a chance to Pain's eyes didn't even widen as his hand suddenly shot up at nearly the same moment as Naruto's as twin cries of the same technique resounded in the open space. "Shinra Tensei!" Yagura had once used his water mirroring technique to replicate the effects of a Shinra Tensei, cancelling out Naruto's own use of the jutsu. However, Pain's was no replica, it wasn't even an inferior version. It was the same technique. However, the difference here was that it was being wielded by a man with much more practice and experience. The two waves of gravitational force met in between the two Rinnegan users, twisting the air, the very space around them, and blasting away the dust as the primordial forces opposed one another. A sudden shockwave surprised both men, forcing them to hunker low or be blown completely away by the sudden force. "Naruto." The blonde looked around, seeing Hiruzen look up at him wearily, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "He is not Aloe." The warning would come too late though, as something landed in the space between the two men like a meteor. Before Naruto even got a good look at the newcomer, he was sprinting towards the blonde. All he saw before a crippling pain racked his body was another set of Rinnegan eyes, making his own widen in confusion before he was sent flying across the village. His eyes had captured every detail in that last second, so he could clearly remember the man with 6 arms, all of which looked unsettlingly mechanical, as he used all of them to punch him clean across the sky. It was something Naruto had himself done with the Azura Path, using a piston at the elbow to create massive propelling force. However, those eyes, there were 2 Rinnegan users after him? He couldn't think about it much longer, as he suddenly crashed straight through a wall some 3 stories up. As he lay there in the rubble he had created in his landing, he glanced about, seeing where he was. A choked, amused laugh couldn't help but roll off his tongue as he realized just where he had landed. The Pain with spiky hair glanced up at the building his opponent had flown into, the hospital. He had been about to enter to flush the Jinchuriki out only for the boy to do his job for him, as he suddenly appeared in the very same hole he had created. Oddly enough though, the boy seemed to have changed his attire, donning a long red haori over a bare chest as well as a Majitama necklace composed of white beads, similar to the one now hanging in his ear. The most noticeable change though was the horned forehead protector with no symbol, and the long wooden shikuju he now held in his hand. The two met eyes again as Naruto looked down on the Akatsuki member from 3 stories up, his haori moving in the wind and the bell in his hair tie tinkling softly with the breeze. "Okay, now I'm ready." That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.